Edwin Merrick pressed his boot against the edge of Silas Blackwood's desk and smiled at the empty chair like a man who had already moved in. 7 days, he said quietly, lifting the framed land deed from the wall with both hands. 7 days and not one soul brought him back breathing. He turned the frame over, studied the signature, and set it face down on the floor. Mine now. His clerk shifted in the doorway. So the search isn't officially. It's officially whatever I say it is. Merrick walked to the window and looked out at Blackwood Ranch, spreading across the northern plains like something God had personally measured and staked. Thousands of acres, thousands of cattle, and one inconvenient man who had finally stopped being inconvenient. He straightened his collar. Draw up the transfer papers. This story already has you gripping your seat. You haven't seen anything yet. Subscribe to our channel right now so you don't miss a single chapter of what's coming. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it really began. The riderless stallion came through the center of Dry Creek on a Tuesday evening, and nobody who saw it ever quite forgot the sight. The animal was lathered and trembling, moving with the broken, stumbling gait of something that had run far past the point of sense. Its saddle was torn along the left fender, the leather darkened with something that caught the last light in a way that made people stop talking mid-sentence. One stirrup swung loose, the other was bent at an angle no normal ride could explain. People came out of storefronts. A woman pulled her children off the road without knowing exactly why. An old man sitting outside the feed store took his hat off and held it against his chest before anyone had said a word. Hector Prine, one of Blackwood's cattle hands, caught the stallion's bridle in front of the sheriff's office. He looked at the dried blood along the stirrup leather. Then he looked up at the crowd gathering around him. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Hector said, "That's Silas's horse." And that was how Dry Creek learned that the most powerful man in the territory had disappeared. Sheriff Amos Danner organized the first search party within the hour. He pulled together 15 men, the best trackers available, cowboys who knew the mesas and canyon country north of town the way most people knew their own kitchen floors. They rode out before dark and came back the following afternoon with nothing to show for it except sunburned necks and tired horses. Danner sent a second party, then a third. He brought in a man from Callaway County who had tracked fugitives across open desert for 20 years and charged twice what any local tracker asked. That man spent 2 full days in the field, came back to town, collected his fee, and told Danner straight to his face that Silas Blackwood was dead somewhere in the canyon country and wasn't going to be found until the buzzards made the location obvious. By the 5th day, 6 separate search parties had crossed the mesas in every direction. Everyone came back empty. The territorial judge sent a telegram asking Danner what was happening. Edwin Merrick sent flowers to the Blackwood Ranch house, addressed to nobody in particular. People in town began talking about Silas the way people talk about someone at a funeral past tense, with that particular kind of careful sadness that's really just barely disguised impatience to move on. Cattle hands gathered in small groups outside the bunkhouse and argued in low voices about whether their wages would continue and who would be running things now, and whether the ranch itself would survive whatever came next. On the evening of the 7th day, Sheriff Danner stood in the middle of Main Street with his hands in his pockets and looked north toward the Mesa country and said, loud enough for the people around him to hear, "No man survives a week in the Badlands with injuries. Not in this heat." He went inside and poured himself a drink. The search was over. Lenora Whitfield heard about it, standing in line at Caldwell's dry goods store with 37 cents in her coat pocket and a list of things she couldn't afford. The woman ahead of her was telling someone else the news, and Lenora stood quietly with her list and listened and didn't say anything at first. She had learned long ago that Dry Creek had very specific ideas about which women were allowed to have opinions about things. And a 32-year-old widow with 2 children and a homestead that was one bad winter away from collapse was not generally one of them. But she kept thinking about the stallion. She had seen Hector lead it down the street that first Tuesday evening. She'd been on her way back from the mill, with Tobias and June trailing behind her, and she had stopped and looked at the horse the same way everyone else had. But she had looked at specific things that most people hadn't. The horse's rear hooves had been pale with a particular kind of dust, not the red sandstone dust that coated most of the mesa country north of town, not the brown alkaline dust from the flatlands to the east. Limestone, pale, almost white, the kind that only surfaced in one place within reasonable distance. Widowmaker Gorge. The search parties had skipped it. She'd heard Danner explain why the main entrance was barely wide enough for a single rider, let alone a group of mounted men working in coordination. If someone had gone in on foot or on a smaller animal, the parties might have missed sign entirely. And none of the experienced trackers from town had apparently thought to get down on their knees and look at what was packed underneath the stallion's rear shoes before the animal was washed and stabled. Lenora had thought about it for 6 days and hadn't said anything because nobody would have listened. Now Danner had called off the search. She went home, put her children to bed, sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a long time, and made a decision. In the morning, she packed rope, water, dried meat, a lantern she'd been careful to keep full, and her late husband's patchwork quilt into the canvas bags that hung from her old mule's sides. The mule was called Preach, for reasons nobody fully remembered anymore, and he was somewhere between 15 and 20 years old and had a disposition that fell roughly between resigned and antagonistic, depending on the day. He was also the most sure-footed animal Lenora had ever dealt with, which was more important right now than Spirit. Tobias was already up when she came inside. He was 11 and had his father's way of watching things carefully before speaking, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the packed bags visible through the window and said, "Where are we going?" "Widowmaker Gorge." A pause. Sheriff said, "I know what the sheriff said." Tobias was quiet for a moment. "You think Mr. Blackwood went in there? I think his horse came out of there, which means something happened in between." Another pause. Tobias turned and went to wake June without being asked. Lenora loved him fiercely for that. June was 8 and had her mother's stubborn streak and her father's inconvenient habit of saying out loud what everyone else was only thinking. Came out rubbing sleep from her eyes and looked at the situation and said, "Is this the thing where we do something everyone else says is stupid, and then it turns out we were right?" "Something like that," Lenora said. "Okay." June started putting on her boots. They were on the road before full light. The townspeople who saw them go had varied reactions. Marta Sagal, who ran the laundry on Prescott Street, called out from her porch, asking where Lenora thought she was going. And when Lenora told her, Marta stared for a moment and then said loudly that chasing a dead man into canyon country with 2 children was just about the most reckless foolishness she had heard of this year, which was saying something. Old Purvis Kane, who had done some trapping in his younger years, watched from his bench in front of the hardware store and said nothing until they had almost passed. And then he said quietly, "Watch the shale on the north face, girl." Slides without warning. Lenora thanked him. She meant it. The road north narrowed quickly once you left town. By mid-morning, it had become little more than a livestock trail threading through the scrub. And by early afternoon, it had stopped pretending to be a trail at all and had given way to open canyon country where you found your own way or didn't find it. Preach picked his footing with the careful attention of an animal who had been in this kind of terrain before and had opinions about it. Tobias walked beside the mule for stretches, keeping a hand on the lead rope. June walked on Lenora's other side, not complaining, watching the rocks. The entrance to Widowmaker Gorge announced itself subtly a narrowing of the canyon walls, a shift in the color of the stone from red sandstone to something paler and older-looking. A drop in temperature that Lenora felt in her forearms before she consciously registered it. The passage was exactly as she'd heard described. A man on horseback could get through it barely, if the horse was narrow-bodied and the rider pressed flat. A group of mounted men trying to work together would have found it impossible. Preach fit with room to spare. Inside the gorge was a different world. The walls rose steeply on both sides, layered in colors rust and cream and a deep burgundy that only showed near the top where the afternoon light hit it directly. The floor was a mix of packed stone and loose shale, and the occasional dry stream bed, and it branched repeatedly, splitting into narrower passages that led to wider chambers that led to more passages. Lenora moved slowly. She was looking at the ground, looking at the walls, looking at the places where stone had been recently disturbed and where it hadn't. She found a snapped branch about a quarter-mile in fresh enough that the exposed wood was still pale, hadn't darkened yet. Another 100 yards, and she found a boot scrape against the sandstone face of a low ledge, the kind of mark you left when you were moving fast and not paying attention to what your feet were doing. Then a piece of black wool caught high on a cactus spine, the kind of thing that snagged from a jacket or a coat when someone brushed past in a hurry. She was tracking a man who had been moving fast, moving desperate, or a man who had been dragged or thrown. She kept moving. It was June who heard it first. They had stopped, so Lenora could study a fork in the passage, trying to determine which branch showed more sign of recent passage. And June had gone very still, the way she did sometimes when she was listening hard. Mama Lenora looked at her. 3 knocks, June said. Someone hitting stone. Lenora heard nothing. But she had learned a long time ago not to dismiss what June noticed when June was being quiet about it. Which direction? June pointed left, toward the narrower of the 2 branches. They went left. The passage tightened until Lenora had to turn sideways in places, pulling Preach's lead rope and listening to the mule make his particular sound of disapproval. Then the passage opened again into a wider space, a kind of rough chamber where the canyon ceiling had partially collapsed at some point, leaving a tumbled field of broken rock and dust. Lenora stopped. She looked at the debris field. The largest pieces of fallen stone were old, settled, crusted with lichen in places. But some of the smaller pieces at the edge were not old, fresh broken and pale-faced, and they were stacked wrong, not how stone falls naturally, but stacked with a purpose, arranged. Someone had built something here, or someone had been buried here. Her chest tightened. She called out, not loudly, sound carried strange in canyon country, and she didn't know yet who else might be listening. She kept it low, pitched to carry into stone gaps. Is someone there? Nothing. She moved closer to the debris field. If you can hear me, knock something. The silence stretched long enough that she started to think she was wrong, that June had heard wind or a settling stone or an animal, that this was the end of a trail that had never led anywhere, that Silas Blackwood was dead in some other fold of canyon country that she'd never find. Then she heard it. 3 knocks. Faint, effortful, coming from beneath a shelf of collapsed rock toward the far side of the chamber. Lenora moved fast. She handed Preach's rope to Tobias without a word and climbed across the debris field on her hands and knees, testing each foothold until she reached the collapsed shelf. There was an opening barely where the largest piece of fallen stone had tilted against a lower ledge and left a gap roughly the width of a man's shoulders. The darkness inside was complete. She lit the lantern. She crawled through. The space inside was roughly coffin-sized, which was not a comparison she wanted to make. The ceiling was jagged rock, angled sharply downward. The air smelled of dust and something else, the close, specific smell of fever sweat and dried blood. Silas Blackwood lay against the far end, one leg partially pinned under a broken timber that Lenora recognized as an axle beam from a heavy wagon. His right shoulder was at an angle that made her stomach clench. His face was gaunt in the lantern light, sunken in a way that a strong man's face only gets after the body has been eating itself for days. But his eyes were open, and they were tracking the light. Lenora held the lantern closer, his eyes focused on her. The silence between them lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it felt much longer. Then Silas Blackwood, who was known across the territory as a man who showed nothing to anyone, opened his cracked and bloodied mouth and said, in a voice like old gravel, "You're not who I expected." "No," Lenora said, "I don't expect I am." A breath. They stopped searching. Lenora looked him over methodically while he spoke, assessing the leg, the shoulder, the color of his skin in the lantern light. "I know. How long?" He stopped and swallowed with obvious difficulty. "How long?" 7 days since your horse came in." Something moved across his face. Not quite pain, more like a man doing arithmetic and not liking the answer. "I thought maybe 3. You've been running a fever." She shifted the lantern to get a better look at the beam pinning his leg. "How long has that been on you?" "Since the 2nd night." He coughed, and she saw what it cost him. Something shifted, settled different. "Can you feel your foot?" Pause that told her more than an answer would have. Some, not all, not as bad as she'd feared, maybe. Bad enough. She backed out of the opening and called to Tobias in a low voice, explaining what she needed: the longest rope in the canvas bags, the thick juniper branch she'd brought, because her husband had taught her to always carry something that could serve as a lever. Preach maneuvered to the side of the debris field where the stone was most stable underfoot. Tobias relayed the information to June, and they moved with the focused efficiency of children who had grown up in circumstances that required them to be useful. Lenora watched them for a moment with a feeling too complicated and too private to name, then turned back to the opening in the rock. She went back in. "I need you to be honest with me," she said. "Not polite, honest." Silas looked at her. "All right. The leg, the pinned one. When we move that beam, there's going to be pain. Considerable pain. I need to know if you think you can stay conscious through it, because if you can't, I need to know before we start, not after." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been lying here for 7 days," he said. "I can handle pain." "That's not what I asked." He met her eyes. "I'll stay conscious." "All right." She heard Tobias outside positioning preach, heard June directing her brother in the particular bossy tone she used when she was scared and hiding it behind competence. Lenora positioned herself beside the axle beam. "I'm going to need you to help when you can," she said. "Push with whatever you have left. The moment you feel the weight start to lift, you pull yourself clear. Don't wait to see if I can hold it, just move." Silas looked at her steadily. "You've done this kind of thing before. My husband was a trapper. Things went wrong sometimes. Where is he now?" Lenora didn't answer immediately. She found her grip on the juniper branch, used it to test the beam's weight, felt the resistance, and calculated what they were working against. 3 years gone, she said. Fever. Silas was quiet. "Ready," she said. "Ready." What followed was ugly and exhausting, and not remotely graceful, which was the truth of most things that actually mattered. The rope looped through a gap in the overhead rock, gave them a mechanical advantage that Preach's stolid pulling translated into slow, grinding upward pressure on the beam. The juniper branch gave Lenora a lever point where the angle was wrong for a straight lift. She threw everything she had into it, felt her shoulder screaming, felt her boots losing purchase on the stone floor, heard Silas make a sound that was not quite human, and then heard him go silent in the way that meant he was putting everything into not making that sound again. The beam shifted, moved. Lenora heard Tobias outside urging Preach in a low, urgent voice. The beam lifted 2 inches. 3. "Move," she said through clenched teeth. Silas moved. It wasn't graceful. He dragged himself with his arms, his face white and tight with something beyond pain, and got his leg clear just as Lenora's grip gave, and the beam dropped back with a crack that threw stone dust into the air. She sat on the floor of that dark little space and breathed for a moment. Then she looked at Silas. He was breathing too, fast and shallow, one arm over his face. "Leg," she said. He lowered his arm and looked at her. "I want to look at it. Tell me when you're ready." "I'm ready." The leg was badly bruised, possibly cracked in one place along the lower bone, the kind of injury that would hurt for months and might never entirely stop. But it was not the catastrophic damage she had feared. He would walk again, probably. He would need a great deal of time and proper care, but he would walk. "Can you get yourself to the opening?" she asked. "With help." "I'll help." When they emerged from the rock, Tobias and June were waiting. June looked at Silas with the direct, assessing gaze of a child who had not yet learned the social rules requiring you to pretend you don't notice things. "You look terrible," she said. Tobias started. "He does," June said, unapologetic. "That's not rude, that's just true." Silas looked at her. "What's your name?" "June Whitfield." "Well, June Whitfield," he said, and his voice was steadier than she'd expected. "I feel terrible, so I suppose we're in agreement." June considered this, seemed to find it acceptable, and reached into the front pocket of her coat. She pulled out a biscuit, slightly flattened, wrapped in cloth that Lenora recognized as the last one from the morning's food. She held it out to Silas. He looked at it. "I can't take a child's food," he said. "I'm not giving it to you," June said. "I'm sharing it." She broke the biscuit in half with both hands and held one half out. "That one's yours. Mine's mine. That's different from giving." Silas Blackwood, who had not become the most powerful man in the territory by being a sentimental fool, took his half of the biscuit. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Lenora wrapped him in the old patchwork quilt, which was faded and mended in 6 places, and smelled like the cedar chest where she kept it, and began the calculation of how to move a badly injured 200-pound man out of a canyon before the temperature dropped. That was when Silas grabbed her wrist. His grip was weak compared to what it must have been, but it stopped her. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Before we go." His eyes were clear, not fever-glazed, not confused. Clear and specific, and carrying something he had apparently been waiting 7 days to say to someone. "My wagon didn't fail," he said. Lenora looked at him. "I checked the brake assembly myself that morning. Both lines were good leather, new treated. Someone cut one of them, not partway all the way. Clean edge. I saw it in the second before the whole thing went." "Where did this happen?" "Mesa Road, North Bend." Storm had the road soft. When the brake failed on the downslope, the wagon went sideways and went over the edge. He paused. "Before that, maybe a mile back, I saw 2 riders on the ridge above me. I thought they were just heading the same direction." "You'd seen them before?" His jaw tightened. "One of them works for Edwin Merrick." That name landed in the air between them. Edwin Merrick was Silas's business partner, had been for years. Everyone in Dry Creek knew the partnership. Merrick handled the financial arrangements, the banking relationships, the paperwork that kept a ranch of that size operating as a legal and financial enterprise. He was a careful, precise man who wore Eastern clothes and never raised his voice, and was, in the estimation of most of Dry Creek, the kind of man you trusted automatically because he looked like the kind of man you trusted. "Merrick," Lenora said, "I found something 2 weeks before this happened. Documents he'd been keeping separately, not in the main ranch accounts, not anywhere I was supposed to see. He'd been forging loan agreements against the ranch properties, taking out loans in my name with banks in other territories, diverting the cattle sale proceeds to cover the interest and keep it hidden." Silas's grip tightened slightly on her wrist. "If I died intestate with no heir and the property in financial dispute, he had the legal paperwork to claim the ranch as settlement against the forged debts. He'd been building toward it for 3 years. Lenora sat with that for a moment. 3 years. "You didn't report it. I was gathering proof. I wanted everything before I went to the judge." A pause. "I waited too long." "Yes," Lenora said, not unkindly. "You did." She started to stand. The sound reached them before she was fully upright. Hoofbeats. Above them on the canyon rim, not on the floor. Moving slowly, deliberately, the way riders move when they're looking for something, rather than going somewhere. Lenora went still. Tobias heard it too. He looked at his mother with wide eyes and didn't say anything. 2 figures appeared on the canyon, rim above them, silhouetted against the sky. Even from below, even at that distance, there was nothing casual about the way they were sitting their horses. They were scanning the gorge floor with systematic attention. One of them had a rifle across his saddle. "You know them?" Lenora said quietly, not looking up. Silas had gone very still. "Rafe Calder," he said low. "And the other one will be Nolan Voss. Merrick uses them for things he doesn't want attached to his name." Lenora watched the 2 riders on the rim. They hadn't seen them yet. The shadow of the overhang above the collapsed chamber was covering their position. But Calder was working his way along the rim in their direction, and his horse was moving with the slow, patient progress of a man who was going to cover every foot of ground above this gorge until he found what he was looking for. "They're not coming to help," Silas said. "No," Lenora said. "I didn't think so." She looked at the gorge around them, at her injured man, at her 2 children, at her aging mule, at the rope and the lantern and the patchwork quilt. Then she looked deeper into Widowmaker Gorge. The passage went on, twisting away into shadow. She made her decision. "Can you be moved?" she asked Silas. He looked at her. "Do we have a choice?" "Not a good one," Lenora said. He met her eyes. "Then move me." Lenora moved first because someone had to. She didn't stand up straight, didn't make any movement that would break the shadow line above them. She kept low and turned to Tobias and spoke directly into his ear, barely a breath, the way she used to speak to him when he was small, and she needed him to stay quiet during a bad storm. "Take Preach's rope. Keep him close to the wall. Don't let him shake his head." Tobias nodded once and moved. June was already watching her mother with the particular expression she wore when she was frightened and refusing to show it, chin slightly forward, eyes too still. Nora touched her daughter's shoulder and pointed deeper into the gorge, the direction they needed to go, and June turned and looked and nodded. Silas had pushed himself upright against the rock face. His face was the color of old ash, but his jaw was set, and he was watching the two riders on the rim above with the concentrated attention of a man cataloging a threat rather than panicking at it. "How far can you walk?" Lenora asked him low. "Far enough." "That's not an answer." 20 yards, he said, maybe 30 before the leg gives. She did the math quickly. 20 yards got them into the next bend of the passage, out of direct sightline from the rim above. After that, the canyon walls angled in a way that would make it harder for riders to track them from above without coming down to the floor. The problem was that Calder and Voss would come down eventually. "There's something I need to tell you," Silas said. "Tell me while we move." She got under his left arm, took his weight across her shoulders, and felt the full reality of him, how much bigger he was than her, how much of that size had burned away in 7 days, how what remained was still considerable. Her knees adjusted. She found her footing. "I hid documents," he said, keeping his voice to the same low register she was using. "Before I left that morning, in my ranch office behind the false panel in the east wall. Everything Merrick did is in there, the forged loan papers, the diverted accounts, correspondence he thought he'd destroyed." A pause as they moved, slow and careful, Tobias leading Preach ahead of them, and June scouting the path. "If something happens to me and those documents don't reach the territorial judge, Merrick walks away with everything." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Lenora said. "You don't know that." "No," she agreed. "But I need you to move faster, so let's not have the conversation where we talk about what might happen." He made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, before his leg caught wrong on a loose piece of shale, and the sound became something else entirely. He recovered without going down, but it cost him, and for about 15 steps after that, he was purely focused on the mechanical problem of moving forward and nothing else. They reached the bend. Lenora looked back. The two figures on the rim were still visible, but the angle had changed. Calder had stopped his horse and was looking down into the gorge, scanning. He hadn't found their position yet, but he was methodical about it, moving his gaze in slow sections, and it was only a matter of time. She turned away from the sight and kept moving. The next quarter-mile was the hardest sustained physical work Lenora had done in years, which was saying something given what her life required. The gorge floor was uneven and treacherous, and in 2 places she had to help Silas across gaps in the stone that he couldn't manage on his own. Preach kept balking in the narrowest sections, requiring Tobias to lean into the lead rope with his whole body weight and speak to the mule in that low, patient voice he'd developed for exactly these situations. June moved ahead of everyone, picking the route, reporting back in whispers. Silas bore the pain without complaint, which she respected, but she could feel it in him, the way his breathing changed when his leg hit wrong, the way his grip on her shoulder went tight in the moments when the agony peaked. He didn't ask to stop. She didn't offer to stop. They had an unspoken agreement about it that required no discussion. "Calder," Silas said, after they had been moving perhaps 20 minutes. "He's good at this. Tracking." "I know." "You know him?" "I know his type. My husband dealt with men like that in the canyon country. Men who track by patience more than by skill." She adjusted her grip. "They don't rush. They work the problem until they find you." "And Voss is worse," Silas said. "Calder's smart, but he has some line he won't cross." "Voss doesn't have that line." Lenora filed that information away without commenting on it. They stopped at a widening in the gorge where a natural shelf of rock created something like an overhang, not a real shelter, but enough cover to pause for 2 minutes without being visible from above. Lenora lowered Silas to a seated position against the wall, and he went down with the careful, controlled movement of someone managing damage they'd already taken. His breathing was harder than she liked. She dug into the canvas bags and found the water container, one of 2 she'd brought, the second already reduced by what she'd given Silas during those initial minutes in the dark. She gave him a careful amount. Not as much as he wanted. She could see he wanted more, but enough. "Drink it slow," she said. He did. June appeared from the shadows ahead. "Gorge forks again, maybe 40 yards ahead. Left branch goes up, I can see light at the top, might open out. Right branch goes deeper, and it's dark." Lenora looked at Silas. "Do you know this section?" I've been into the gorge twice. Never past the first half-mile. He shook his head. I don't know the branches. I do, Lenora said. Both Silas and June looked at her. My husband came through here, 3 winters running, trapping. He made me learn the route because— She stopped, then continued. Because he said knowledge of a place is the only thing that stays with you when everything else goes wrong. She looked at the darkness of the right branch. The right passage cuts west under the cliffs. It's narrow for about 200 yards, and then it opens into an old mining section. There's an exit on the western face that comes out onto the plains. Silas stared at her. You knew this when you came in. I knew it might be useful. You came prepared for a longer route. I came prepared for whatever the situation needed. She stood. The left branch is the obvious choice. If Calder is as good as you say, he'll take the obvious choice when he comes down to the floor. Silas was quiet for a moment. Right branch. Right branch, Lenora confirmed. Getting Silas back to vertical was its own small battle. He was stiffer than before. The brief rest had let his muscles tighten, and the leg was angrier than it had been when they were moving. He said nothing about it, but the sound he made when he put weight on it was involuntary, and she could hear the effort it took him to swallow the rest of what he felt. Tobias, she said. Tobias appeared immediately. I need you on his other side. Tobias was 11 and slight, but he was strong in the particular way that children raised on hard physical work become strong, functional, and efficient, using leverage rather than mass. He got under Silas's right arm without hesitation, and the 3 of them moved into the right branch, with June going ahead with the lantern held low. The passage narrowed almost immediately. Preach protested. Tobias talked the mule through it in the voice that worked, low and steady and slightly bored-sounding, which for reasons no one had ever fully explained, was the register that Preach responded to best. The mule's sides scraped the walls in 2 places, and he stopped twice and had to be coaxed forward, but he kept moving. The passage had the particular quality of spaces that haven't been disturbed in a very long time, a stillness in the air, a smell of old stone and mineral water, a sound like deep quiet rather than silence. Lenora had been in this passage once, years ago, following her husband at midnight with a lantern just like this one, memorizing turns while he narrated them. She had thought at the time that it was the most frightened she'd ever been. She'd been wrong about that, as it turned out. You're remembering something, Silas said. He was reading her, which surprised her. Fever depleted and barely mobile, and he was still paying attention to the person beside him. My husband used to say, the canyon country tells you things if you listen. I thought it was something he said to sound wise. She helped him over a low ridge of stone. It's actually just true. What's it telling you right now? She considered that honestly, that we have maybe 2 hours before Calder figures out which branch we took, and that your fever's climbing again. He didn't deny it. She could feel the heat of him through the cloth of his jacket. Will you make it to the western exit? She asked. Will you carry me if I don't? I'll drag you. Then I'll make it, he said. They moved through the darkness with the lantern, throwing their shadows, large and strange, against the pale limestone walls. Silas was losing definition at the edges. She could feel it in the way his weight shifted against her, less controlled than it had been an hour ago. The fever was working on his concentration, eating at the margins of his focus. He was fighting it, but the fight was expensive and he was running low on resources to pay for it. June had found a section where the passage widened slightly and was waiting for them, the lantern held up to illuminate something on the wall. Lenora came up beside her and saw what her daughter had found: faded marks on the limestone, the kind of claim scratches that old miners made to mark their territory. Decades old. Mostly meaningless now except as confirmation that they were in the right passage. Mama, June said quietly, pointing further along the wall. Lenora looked. Lower down at child height, there were different marks. Recent marks, or recent by comparison, maybe 10 years old, maybe 15. A series of horizontal scratches, 4 of them, in groups that a trapper would recognize as a counting system. And beside the scratches, scratched with the tip of a knife, an arrow pointing west, and the letters E. W. Elias Whitfield, her husband. Lenora stood and looked at those letters for longer than she should have, given the circumstances. She was aware of Tobias seeing them over her shoulder, aware of him going very still. June reached out and touched the letters with 2 fingers. She didn't say anything. Neither did Lenora. Silas, to his credit, said nothing either, and didn't look away from the passage ahead. He understood, she thought, that this was not a moment that required comment from him. They moved on. The passage kept its word eventually, and opened, though not dramatically. It was a gradual widening, the walls retreating by degrees, until suddenly there was space enough to walk without calculating every step. The old mining section announced itself, through smell before sight, a flat mineral scent, something metallic under the limestone, the ghost of old labor. The ruins were spare. Most of what had been built here had collapsed or been taken apart. For materials, there were foundation lines in the stone, corroded iron fittings, the remains of a ventilation shaft that had partially caved. But the ore cart track was still there, running along the western wall, and 2 of the ore carts were still on the rails, tilted but not fallen. Lenora looked at them carefully. The wheels were corroded, but the axles looked solid. The track itself was still seated properly in the stone cut. Years of disuse hadn't shifted it significantly. She looked at Silas. He was leaning against the wall with his eyes at half-mast, which was worse than she'd expected. The walk through the passage had taken more out of him than either of them had planned for. "I need to rest," he said. Just said it, flatly, without embarrassment. "I know." She guided him to the ground, kept him from going down too hard. 15 minutes. Called her. 15 minutes. Won't lose us what we can't afford to lose. She pulled the quilt from the canvas bag and settled it around him. "Drink." He drank. Tobias was already examining the ore carts, pushing at one experimentally, checking the wheel response. He looked back at his mother. "One of these might work," he said. "I know, that's what I'm thinking. The track runs west."
Yes.
Tobias thought about that and its implications. If we put him in the cart, we'd have to transfer him from the drag sled. She looked at Silas, who had his head back against the wall and his eyes closed, which means moving him twice. But if the cart rolls, the mule can pull it on the track instead of through open rock. Faster and easier on him. She paused. "Check the second cart, too. See which one's in better shape." Tobias moved to comply. June sat beside Silas. She didn't say anything. She just sat there with the practical, uncomplicated presence of a child who has decided someone needs company and is providing it without making a production of the decision. Silas opened one eye. "You don't have to babysit me," he said. "I'm not babysitting you," June said. "I'm keeping you from falling over. Those are different things." He looked at her with that particular expression adults wear when a child has said something that hits closer than they expected. You're very sure of the difference between things. "Most differences aren't complicated," June said. "People just act like they are because it's easier." A short silence. "Your mother teach you that?" "My dad did." A pause, completely level. "He died." "I know," Silas said. "I'm sorry." June thought about that. "Were you nice to him? Did you know him?" "I knew who he was. Silas Whitfield. He sold us some canyon maps, 2 seasons back. Good maps." He shifted his position and winced. He seemed like a man who knew what he was doing. June absorbed this and filed it somewhere. "He was," she said. Lenora was watching from across the chamber and decided that moment was between the 2 of them and didn't need her in it. She turned to check on Tobias's progress with the carts. The second cart was in better shape. The wheels moved with resistance but moved, and the axle had enough integrity to hold weight. Tobias had found a piece of old timber and was using it to lever the cart fully onto the rails. "It'll hold him," Tobias said. "Maybe not both of us, too. It doesn't need to hold both of us. We walk." "What about the sled pieces?" Lenora had dragged sections of Silas's wrecked wagon through most of the gorge to build the drag sled. "Leave what we can't use. The cart changes what we need." They worked together in the efficient, quiet way that had developed between them over years of doing necessary things in hard circumstances. Tobias was methodical and didn't rush and didn't cut corners, which she had worked to teach him and which she was grateful for now. June, when she came to help, brought the same focus. Getting Silas into the cart was the moment she had been managing toward and dreading in equal measure. She explained it to him clearly and simply, what they were doing, what she needed him to do, what she needed him not to do. He listened. "On 3, she said. It took 6 attempts and produced sounds from Silas that she was confident he was not proud of and would not have made if he'd had any choice about it. By the end, he was in the cart and breathing like he'd run a mile, and his face was the specific color of a man who has just passed through the far edge of what he thought he could endure. But he was in. Lenora attached Preach's lead to the front of the cart with 2 knots she trusted. Tobias, push from behind when the track levels out. June, stay on my left side where I can see you. She clicked her tongue at Preach. The mule leaned into the lead. The cart resisted. She clicked again. Preach dug in, and the cart began to move. The sound was terrible, a grinding, shrieking protest from metal that had been still for decades, and Lenora's first thought was that Calder would hear it from wherever he was in the gorge and know exactly where they were. Her second thought was that there was nothing to do about it, so she kept Preach moving. Cart found its rhythm after about 30 yards. The worst of the corrosion shook loose, and the wheels began to roll with something approaching the function they'd been built for. It wasn't smooth, the track had settled unevenly in places, and there were jolts that made Silas grip the cart's sides with both hands, but it was faster than carrying him. Considerably faster. They went west. The mining passage curved and descended gradually, and the descent helped Preach didn't have to pull uphill, just guide the cart's speed. Tobias ran alongside when the grade increased, braking with his hands against the cart's rear frame to keep it from getting ahead of the mule. Lenora walked beside Silas. "How are you doing?" she asked. "Honestly, yes, I've been better. Can you be more specific?" He thought about it. The fever's making it harder to think straight. "I know what's happening, I just can't things keep going sideways at the edges." He paused. "How much further?" "I don't know exactly." My husband's route notes said, "The western exit was about a mile from the mining section." She looked at the cart rails running ahead of them into the dark. "Track might run most of the way. Might. He was quiet for a moment. "If it doesn't, we improvise," Lenora said. "You say that like it's easy. It's not easy. It's just the only option, so the difficulty doesn't matter." She heard him exhale. Not quite a laugh. Something adjacent. "I spent years," he said slowly, thinking through the words more carefully than a man would, in normal circumstances, which she understood was the fever making him work harder for each sentence, making sure I always had options. Backup arrangements, contingencies. Spent so much on it. Made sure there was never a moment when I was dependent on one thing going right. He paused. And then one bad brake line, and here I am in an ore cart being pushed through an old mine by a widow and her 2 children. "Does that bother you?" she asked. A pause. "No," he said, like the answer surprised him. That's what's strange about it. They moved in silence for a stretch. Lenora was doing what she had been doing, since they started moving, splitting her attention between the path ahead, the sounds behind them, Silas's condition, and the children's positions. It was a kind of multiple awareness that she'd developed over years of managing a homestead alone, where the cost of missing something was usually borne immediately and entirely by herself and the people who depended on her. She heard the sound and identified it before she consciously processed what she was hearing. Boots on stone, behind them, not the random sound of settling rock or an animal. Deliberate, rhythmic footfall, moving with purpose. She held up a hand. Everyone stopped. Preach stopped. Cart stopped. The footsteps behind them continued for 2 more seconds, and then also stopped. Calder had found the right branch. Lenora looked at the passage ahead. The darkness was total beyond the lantern's reach. She looked at the darkness behind them. The same. Calder was back there with better eyes than hers. In this dark he'd had time to adjust, coming through the passage without a light. She was near certain of that. A man who tracked by patience wouldn't give away his position with a lantern if he could avoid it. She thought of the things she had. Rope, the lantern itself as a tool rather than just a light source. The cart, the mule, 200 yards of tight passage behind her, and an unknown distance of mining track ahead, and the particular knowledge of this canyon that she had memorized in a different life from a man who was no longer alive to use it himself. She leaned toward Tobias. "Keep Preach moving," she breathed. "Slow, steady. Don't stop until I catch up." Tobias looked at her. "Mama, Silas needs to keep moving. His fever." She didn't finish that sentence. She didn't need to. Tobias understood what fever did and what it meant to stop in the cold with a man who was already losing the fight against it. "What are you going to do?" June asked. Not panicked, just asking. "Buy us some time," Lenora said. She handed Tobias the lantern. She took the rope from the canvas bag, the longest piece, the one they'd used to free Silas's leg, back in the chamber. She went back down the passage alone, into the dark, working by touch and memory, her hands trailing the wall, counting her steps. She was counting toward something specific. Her husband's route notes, memorized over 2 evenings by lantern light in their kitchen, she had always the kind of memory that held spatial information precisely, routes and distances, and the relationships between things in 3 dimensions. Elias had called it her canyon mind. He'd said it like it was a gift. Right now it was a tool. 40 steps back from where they'd stopped, there was a section of the mining passage ceiling that had been shored up with old timber. She'd seen it in the lantern light when they passed. Had noted it the way she noted everything without stopping to think why. The timbers were old, badly old. The kind of old where they looked structural but weren't, where they were holding up the accumulated weight of habit rather than actual stone. She found them by touch. She found the rope's best angle by touch. She worked fast and not gracefully, and not without fear, because fear was appropriate here, and pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of stupidity. Behind her, somewhere in the dark, Calder was moving again. She could hear him. He was close. "I know you're there," Calder's voice said, maybe 30 feet away, maybe less. Calm, almost conversational. That was the worst version of this. She knew the man who didn't need to shout because he wasn't afraid of what he was doing. "I can hear the cart. I know which way you're going." Lenora finished the knot. "You're a woman alone in a mine with a dying man and 2 kids," Calder continued. "Closer now. There's nowhere to go that I won't follow. So let's just stop this." She pulled the rope. The old timbers didn't fail. All at once, there was a groan, a crack, a terrible hesitation where nothing happened, and she thought she'd misjudged the structural situation entirely. Then the ceiling gave. Not catastrophically, not a full collapse. Enough. Stone and old timber, and 50 years of accumulated debris, came down in a section about 15 feet long and filled the passage with a wave of dust and sound that hit her like a wall. She was already running, had already turned, and was moving the moment she felt the rope tension release, and the debris caught the edge of her coat and tore it, but didn't catch her. Behind her, in the dark and the settling dust, she heard Calder. He was swearing. He was alive and swearing, and apparently unhurt, which she noted with an emotion she couldn't entirely name. It wasn't exactly relief, and it wasn't exactly anything else. But he was on the wrong side of several feet of debris. She ran toward the light. She ran toward the cart and the mule and her children, and the sound of June's voice calling for her in a low, urgent tone that was trying to be quiet and not quite managing it. And she ran until the passage opened, and the lantern light found her, and she was back with them, and the cart was still moving, and Silas had both hands on the sides and his eyes open. He looked at her, looked at the tear in her coat, the white limestone dust covering her from the waist down. "The ceiling came down," he said. "Part of it," she agreed, catching her breath. "How much time did that buy us?" She looked back at the dark passage. "Enough to get you out of here," she said. "That's all I need it to buy." Silas looked at her for a long moment with an expression she didn't have a name for and didn't try to catalog. Then he nodded once and faced forward. Lenora clicked her tongue at "Preach." The mule leaned in. The cart kept moving west. The passage changed gradually over the next stretch, the mining cut giving way to natural canyon again, the track ending abruptly where the rails had been pulled up at some point, leaving just the stone floor and the western walls closing in. The walls were closing inward and upward, rather than narrowing, which meant the ceiling was rising, and after another 10 minutes of walking, she could feel the air changing the way air changes when there's open space ahead of it. Tobias felt it, too. "We're getting close," he said. "Yes. How do you know?" "The air smells like grass," June said, from 2 steps ahead of everyone. Tobias blinked. "Does it?" "Yes." June kept walking. "It smells like the south field after rain. That means we're near the plains." Silas, who had been drifting in and out of useful consciousness for the last 20 minutes, opened his eyes and breathed in through his nose. Something in his face changed. "She's right," he said quietly. Lenora didn't tell them that she had been tracking the same smell for the last 5 minutes and had been afraid to say anything in case she was wrong. She let them have the discovery. She was running on less than nothing by now, no food, since a few bites of dried meat 3 hours ago, water reduced to what she'd kept back for herself after giving the rest to Silas and the children. Her shoulder aching from the combination of supporting his weight and pulling ceiling timbers. Her legs were doing what legs do when you've been pushing them for too long, which was to say they were working fine, but registering their opinion of the situation in a steady, non-negotiable way. She kept walking. The canyon exit appeared not as a dramatic opening, but as a gradual thinning of the walls, a brightening of the rock, and then suddenly, not gradually at all, as a rectangle of orange light ahead of them that resolved into a view of the western plains and the sky above them, burning with the particular colors of late afternoon, rust and amber, and a deep gold that had no business being as beautiful as it was given everything else that was happening. Lenora stopped at the exit and looked out at the plains spreading west. She looked for riders, for movement, for anything that shouldn't be there. She saw open country, empty at least for the distance she could see. Behind her, she heard Silas say something. She turned. He was trying to get out of the cart on his own, which was not going to work, and she crossed back to him and got her shoulder under his arm again and helped him to standing. He stood, unsteady, badly so, but standing. He looked at the exit, at the open country beyond it, at the light. "My people will be looking from the east," he said. "Ranch hands, they patrol the eastern mesas. That's miles from here. The Halverson Ridge is maybe 2 miles north. They use it as a lookout." He looked at her. "If someone's up there, we make ourselves visible," Lenora said. He nodded. "Can you make it 2 more miles?" she asked. He looked at her with fever-bright eyes, and the particular expression of a man who is not going to say no to that question, regardless of the honest answer. "Ask me something harder," he said. The 2 miles to Halverson Ridge turned out to be the longest 2 miles Lenora had ever measured. Not because of the distance. She had walked longer distances in worse conditions. But distance on open flat ground with a mule and 2 children was one thing. Distance on open flat ground with a man who was losing his fight against fever by the half hour, who needed her shoulder every 30 steps and her full weight every 60, who was still refusing to say so, that was a different calculation entirely. They had been moving for maybe 20 minutes when Silas stopped. Not gradually. He just stopped, mid-stride, and stood very still. And Lenora felt the change in his weight before she understood what was happening. "Silas, give me a second. You don't have a second to spare right now. Give me one anyway." She gave it to him. She stood beside him on the open plain, with the last of the afternoon light stretching their shadows long across the dry grass, and she waited while he did whatever internal negotiation he needed to do. June had stopped too, and was watching with that careful, too-still expression. Tobias kept Preach moving in a small circle to stop the mule from settling. Silas exhaled. "All right," he said. "All right, what?" "All right, I'm moving." He straightened against her shoulder. "I just needed the world was going sideways, the fever." "Yes. It's going to get worse before we get you to a doctor." "I know that. I need you to tell me," she said carefully, "if it gets to the point where you can't walk." "Not after the point." Before it, he looked at her. "Because," she continued, "if you go down on open ground, I cannot get you back up alone. Tobias can help, but there are things that require more than an 11-year-old and a worn-out woman, and if you don't warn me, I won't have time to figure out the alternative." A pause. "That's a very direct way to put it," he said. "Yes." Another pause. "All right, I'll tell you. Thank you." They moved. The grass was dry, and the ground was harder underfoot than the canyon floor had been, which helped with footing but did nothing for the monotony of the effort. Lenora focused on the ridge ahead. She could see the line of it against the sky, the higher ground where Blackwood's ranch hands kept watch over the eastern approaches. 2 miles had been Silas's estimate, and she had no better one. She was measuring it in the length of her own stride, and the number of times Silas had to stop, and the speed at which the ridge was or was not getting closer, and none of those measurements were encouraging. June came up on Silas's free side. She didn't say anything. She just positioned herself there and put her hand against his arm, not gripping it, just present. The way she'd sat beside him in the mining chamber. Silas looked down at her. "I don't need minding," he said. "I know," June said. "I'm walking. This is just the direction I'm going." Silas closed his mouth. They walked. The sun was dropping with the particular efficiency of desert sunsets, going from late afternoon to early evening in what felt like 15 minutes. The temperature dropped with it. Not dramatically, not yet, but enough that Lenora could feel the change on the back of her neck and on her arms where the torn coat sleeve let the air through. She thought about the quilt wrapped around Silas and considered, and decided not to take it back. He needed it more than she did right now. That was a simple fact and not a sacrifice, and she was not going to dress it up as one in her own head. "I'm sorry," Silas said. He said it suddenly, without preamble, and for a moment she thought the fever was making him confused about where he was or who she was. "For what?" "For every time I rode through town," he said, and didn't notice. She wasn't sure what he meant. "The homesteads," he said, "south of town. I knew they were there. I knew the families were having a hard time. I knew the drought years hit the small properties worse than mine because they didn't have the scale to absorb it." He was working hard for the words now, the fever pulling at his concentration. "I didn't do anything with that knowledge." Lenora was quiet for a moment. "You were busy," she said. "That's not an excuse." "No," she agreed. "It's just a reason. What's the difference?" She thought about that, honestly. A reason tells you how something happened. An excuse tells you why it doesn't count. She adjusted her grip on him as the ground softened in a low spot. "You're allowed to have the reason. Just don't call it the other thing." He was quiet long enough that she thought the fever might have taken him sideways again. But then he said, "Your husband. Did he know this country the way you say?" "Better." "How long were you married?" 11 years. A pause. "That's a long time to learn someone." "It's not that long," she said. 11 years, and there were still things I didn't know. Things I found out after." She thought of the scratched initials on the canyon wall. Arrow pointing west. You think you know a person completely, and then they leave something behind that surprises you. Is that he lost the sentence and found it again? Is that hard? To be surprised by someone who's gone? She thought about it the same way she always tried to think about honest questions, actually. "Sometimes," she said. "Sometimes it just feels like they're still talking." Silas didn't say anything to that. They were maybe a half-mile from the ridge base when Tobias stopped. He stopped so abruptly that Preach nearly walked into him, and Lenora looked up sharply. "What?" Tobias pointed. There was a rider on the ridge. One figure, motionless against the sky, looking down at the plain below. The horse was a bay, dark enough to be almost black in the failing light, and the man in the saddle was sitting very still with his hands on the pommel. Looking at them, Lenora's first thought was Voss. Her second thought was that Voss would not have been sitting still and visible. Voss would have been moving, or he would have been invisible. A man who, Silas said, lacked Calder's line would not have announced himself on a ridge line. "Can you see the brand?" she asked Tobias. His eyes were sharper than hers. Tobias squinted. "The horse?" "No, too far, the man's jacket." Tobias looked again. Dark leather, light something on the chest. Could be a badge, could be a pin, could be nothing. Lenora made a decision. She raised her arm over her head. Waved it. Once, twice, large and slow, the way you'd signal at distance. The figure on the ridge didn't move for a long moment. Then it raised one arm back. Then it turned its horse and disappeared below the ridge line, which meant it was coming down. Lenora exhaled. "Ranch hand?" Tobias asked. "I think so." She kept moving. "Keep walking." They met the rider at the ridge base. He was a young man, couldn't have been more than 22, with a broad face, and the particular startled expression of someone who has been conducting a routine patrol and has come over a hill to find something completely outside the parameters of routine. He pulled his horse up hard and stared. At Silas, mostly. His mouth open, Mr. Blackwood. His voice came out strange. Too high, almost. "We thought." "I know what you thought," Silas said. His voice was still clear enough, still carried its own authority, even coming out of a fever-depleted man who was barely staying vertical. "What's your name?" "Cope, sir. Danny Cope. I've been riding with your crew for 8 months. "Cope." Silas held the young man's gaze with what must have been a considerable effort of will. "Ride back to the ranch. Tell Harlan I need a wagon on the western plain, south of Halverson. Tell him to bring 2 other men he trusts completely. Nobody else. No stopping in town. Can you do that?" Danny Cope had gone from startled to focused in about 4 seconds, which suggested he was more capable than his age implied. "Yes, sir." And Cope, Silas paused. Don't tell Edwin Merrick. The young hand's expression shifted a flicker of something. Not quite understanding, but the sense that understanding was standing just outside the door. Yes, sir, he said again, and turned his horse and went. The sound of hoofbeats receded north. Silas let out a breath that had clearly been held for longer than was comfortable. His weight shifted against Lenora's shoulder in a way that told her the effort of that exchange had cost him more than it had looked. Harlan, she said. Who is he? My foreman. 22 years. A pause. He was at the ranch before I was. Came with the land when I bought it. Another pause. If I can't trust Harlan, there's nobody left to trust. How long until the wagon? 40 minutes, maybe less if Cope rides hard. Lenora looked around the flat ground at the ridge base. She found a low outcrop that blocked the wind from the north and steered them toward it. Then we wait here, she said. Getting Silas down to the ground for the second time was easier in the sense that she had already learned his body's weight and how it moved, and harder in the sense that he had less left in him now than he'd had an hour ago. He went down carefully, and she arranged the quilt, and he leaned back against the outcrop with his eyes closed and his jaw tight. June sat next to him again. Tobias tied Preach to a scrub cedar and came back and sat on Lenora's other side. He pulled his knees up and looked at the sky, which was moving from orange into the deep purple that came just before full dark. Are Calder and Voss going to come out of the canyon? He asked. Yes, Lenora said. Tonight? I don't know. It depends on how long it takes to clear the passage and how much they want to be moving in the dark out here. She paused. Probably not tonight, but we can't count on that. Tobias thought about it. So we need to be somewhere they can't reach us before morning. Yes, the ranch? She looked at Silas. His breathing was even, but it was too fast, and the heat coming off him was something she could feel from 6 inches away. The ranch has a house, a real house with walls and a door that locks. She paused. And a bed. He needs a real bed and a doctor. Tobias nodded. A silence fell over them that was not uncomfortable exactly, but was weighted with everything none of them were saying. The kind of silence that gathers in the space where people have been through something together and are only now having the first moment to sit with what that means. June broke it. Mr. Blackwood, she said. Silas opened one eye. When you had a son, June said, what was his name? The single open eye went very still. Lenora tensed. She didn't know where June had gotten that information. She hadn't said anything to the children about what Silas had told her. Then she remembered. Dry Creek was a small town. People talked. June had ears that missed nothing. June, Lenora said, a warning in her voice. It's all right, Silas said. He said it quietly, with something in it that was not quite pain, but was adjacent to it. Both eyes open now. His name was William. We called him Will. June absorbed this. How old was he? 4. A silence. I'm 8, June said. I know. So you've been missing him for a long time. Silas looked at her for a moment. Yes, my dad's been gone 3 years, June said. It gets different. Not better exactly. Just different. She paused, considering her own words. Like how a bruise changes color. It still hurts. It just looks different. Silas looked at the child beside him with an expression that Lenora caught only in profile, and she looked away quickly because it was the kind of expression that wasn't meant for other people to see. It was the expression of someone being reached in a place they'd built walls around, reached easily and without ceremony by a small person who hadn't bothered to notice the walls were there. They sat. The stars came out in the particular way. They came out in open country, not gradually but suddenly, as if they'd been waiting behind a curtain. Tobias fell asleep against Lenora's shoulder without meaning to. She felt him go the specific softening of a child dropping into sleep, and she didn't move, just sat and let him be there. Her own exhaustion was a physical weight now, pressing on everything. She felt it in her lower back and in her hands and behind her eyes, and she let herself feel it without doing anything about it, because there was nothing to do except wait for the wagon. Silas spoke, low, not wanting to wake Tobias. Tell me something about him, he said. She knew who he meant. He sang when he thought nobody could hear him, she said after a moment. Badly, completely unselfconsciously, while he was working. He had maybe 4 songs that he knew all the way through, and he'd cycle through them, and if you came up on him from behind, you'd hear him, and he'd stop and look embarrassed, and you'd both pretend you hadn't heard. A small quiet. That's a good thing to know about someone. Silas said. He was a good man, not a perfect one. She paused. He had a temper when he was frustrated. He had trouble asking for help. He thought he could fix things by working longer instead of differently. She was quiet for a moment. But he was a good man. You don't have to qualify it. I know I don't have to, she said. I want to, because the imperfect parts are part of who he was, and I don't want to do that thing people do after someone dies, where you make them into something they weren't. She looked at the stars. He'd hate that. Silas considered that for a while. My wife was practical, he said finally. More practical than me. She saw things clearly. She had no patience, for she'd have called it drama, but she meant the kind of drama people create when they don't want to deal with a thing directly. A pause. She would have looked at my whole business arrangement with Merrick and told me in about 4 sentences everything that was wrong with it. Did you have a reason not to look too closely yourself? Yes, what was it? The arrangement was convenient, he said, and examining it too closely would have required admitting I'd let myself be used, which I didn't want to do. A beat. Pride is expensive. It is, Lenora agreed. You'd have looked, he said. Not a question. I don't know, she said honestly. I'd like to think so, but I've also spent 3 years telling myself the homestead was all right when it wasn't, because I didn't want to face what facing it would mean. She paused. We're not that different, I think. He looked at her. She looked back. The moment lasted long enough that she became aware of it and then became aware of being aware of it, which was when she looked away and found something in the middle distance that required her attention. Neither of them said anything else about it. The wagon came 43 minutes after Cope rode off. Lenora heard it before she saw it, the particular rhythm of a heavy wagon on dry ground, moving at a pace that was fast for a wagon but controlled, driven by someone who knew the terrain. 2 riders flanked it. Harlan turned out to be a wiry man in his late 50s, with a face that had been weathered into something close to leather, and eyes that were immediately and specifically taking in every detail of the situation, Silas's condition, the woman beside him, the 2 children, the mule. He climbed down from the wagon seat before it had fully stopped and crossed to Silas in 4 strides. He crouched in front of him. He looked at him for a moment. You look like hell, he said. So I've been told, Silas said. Can you stand with help? Harlan looked at Lenora. You're Whitfield's wife. Widow, she said. Right, he said it without apology, just acknowledgement. Cope said you brought him out. We brought him out. Harlan's gaze moved to Tobias and June, stayed there a moment. Then he looked back at Lenora with an expression that was not quite assessment and not quite gratitude, but sat somewhere between them. All right, he said. Let's get him up. Getting Silas into the wagon was a 4-person operation that required planning and produced a result that was functional, if not dignified. And by the end of it, Silas was lying in the wagon bed on a bedroll that Harlan had thought to bring, covered with the patchwork quilt, and he was looking at the stars above him with the expression of a man who is managing something very large in a very small space. Harlan came to where Lenora was standing. The ranch, he said quietly. I've sent for Doc Pierce. He'll be there by the time we arrive. He paused. Merrick sent a man to the ranch this afternoon, asking questions about the property documents. Lenora looked at him. I told him nothing was available without Mr. Blackwood's authorization, Harlan said. He didn't like that. No, Lenora said. I imagine he didn't. There's something else. Harlan lowered his voice further. Day before yesterday, someone went through the ranch office. Careful nothing obviously disturbed. But I know that office, and I know what order things are in, and someone had been through it. Lenora thought of the document Silas had told her about. The false panel in the east wall. Did they find what they were looking for? She asked. Harlan's expression didn't change. I don't know what they were looking for. The east wall, she said. Is there a panel? Harlan looked at her steadily. Then yes. Intact, a pause, I'd have to check. Then we need to get there before Merrick tries again, she said. Harlan nodded once, slowly like a man updating his understanding of the situation by several significant degrees. Get your children in the wagon, he said. We move now. The ride to Blackwood Ranch took the better part of an hour on roads that were smoother than the canyon floor, but rough enough that every significant bump required a check on Silas. Lenora sat in the wagon bed beside him. Tobias and June sat across from them, June already half asleep against Tobias's shoulder. At some point during the ride, Silas reached a period of clear alertness that surprised her. The fever had these patterns. She knew where it would release its grip for an hour and let the person think again and then return with twice the enthusiasm. He used the clear window to tell her, in careful, measured sentences, everything she needed to know about the documents, where precisely they were, what was in them, which ones were most critical for the judge. She listened and held it. "You should be telling Harlan this," she said. "I'm telling you," he said, "because you won't be scared off. You don't know that. I've spent the last 8 hours being dragged through a canyon," he said. "I know." She almost argued with that and then decided it wasn't the moment. "If something happens before we can get those documents to the judge, I told you, nothing's going to happen to you. I'm not talking about me. I'm talking about the documents. If Merrick's man went through the office and found the panel." He stopped, swallowed. "Merrick has legal people on retainer in the Capitol. If he can get there first with a fabricated version of the situation, establish the narrative before I can counter it. Then we get there first," Lenora said. He looked at her. "You make it sound simple. I make it sound necessary," she said. "Which it is." He closed his eyes. She watched him breathe for a while. Then she looked out the back of the wagon, at the plane unrolling behind them in the dark, at the stars above it, at the absence of the canyon that had held them for most of a day. She thought about the panel in the east wall. She thought about Merrick in Silas's office, placing a deed face down on the floor. She thought about the documents that could end all of it, and what happened if they were already gone. The ranch house appeared as a cluster of lights in the dark, several windows lit, which meant people were up and waiting, which was exactly the kind of preparation that suggested Harlan had been managing this situation with more care than anyone knew. The wagon came through the gate and into the yard, and people appeared, ranch hands, 2 of them, and a woman from the house who came down the steps quickly. Lenora climbed out of the wagon and lifted June down, and then Tobias, who was more awake than she'd expected. Then she looked at the house. It was the largest building she had been near in years. That wasn't the kind of thought she'd expected to have in this moment, but it came anyway, the specific awareness of scale that you develop when your own home has 2 rooms and a leaking corner. The main house was 2 stories, stone foundation, wide porch, lit windows on the ground floor. The office would be there, or close. A man she didn't know came out of the front door and down the steps mid-40s, carrying a doctor's bag, which answered one question. Harlan materialized beside her. "Doc Pierce," he said. "He's good." "Good." She watched Pierce cross to the wagon and begin assessing Silas with the brisk, purposeful movements of someone who had been doing this long enough to work without wasted motion. "The office," she said to Harlan. He understood immediately. "This way," he said. She hesitated, looking at her children. Tobias met her eyes. "We'll stay here with the doctor." She looked at him, this 11-year-old boy who had been steady through the whole of it, and felt the particular love that doesn't have words adequate to it. She touched his face once, quickly, and followed Harlan. The office was off the main hall, a heavy door, a room that smelled of paper and leather, and the particular smell of a working operation, ledger books, ink, faint trace of tobacco from a man who occasionally smoked and had been doing so for years in this chair. Lenora stood in the middle of the room and looked at the east wall. Harlan stood in the doorway. She found the panel on the 3rd search. It was well done, set into the paneling so precisely that the gap was essentially invisible unless you knew what to look for and were feeling along the seams with both hands. Pressure point at the top right corner, a slight pivot, and the section of wall swung out on a simple hinge. Behind it, a shallow space, perhaps 8 inches deep, deep enough for a stack of documents in a leather case. Lenora pulled the case out and set it on the desk. She looked at Harlan. He looked at her. She opened the case. The documents were there. All of them the forged loan agreements that Silas had described, the diverted account records, the correspondence that Merrick had apparently believed destroyed. Someone's work across several years, carefully dismantled and documented by the one person Merrick had never thought to watch closely enough. "He kept copies of everything," Harlan said from the doorway. His voice was slightly different. "Quieter, yes." Lenora looked at the stack. "Merrick didn't get here. Not yet." She closed the case. She looked at the room, at the empty desk chair, at the deed on the wall opposite that was still hanging straight, at the evidence in her hands of a man who had been more careful than his enemy had counted on. "I need to get this to the judge," she said. "The circuit judge comes through Dry Creek in 10 days. That's too long." She looked at Harlan. "Can someone ride to the Capitol tonight?" Pause. "I'll go myself," Harlan said. She shook her head. "Silas needs you here. He needs someone who knows this operation and knows who to trust and knows what Merrick might try next." She paused. "Is there someone else? Someone who can ride fast and won't stop?" Harlan thought for a moment. "Cope," he said. She considered it. The young man who had already proven he could take an instruction and move on it without needing things explained twice. "Does he know the Capitol Road?" "Rode it twice last year with the cattle drive." "Then send him tonight," Lenora said, "with the case. And a letter from Silas if he can manage one, even a short one, even a shaky one with the judge's name on it." Harlan looked at her. "You're not someone who usually gives orders," he said. "No," she agreed. "Usually I don't." He nodded. Then, in the tone of a man accepting a situation that was not what he had expected, "All right." She carried the document case back to the main hall. Front door, she stopped. Through the window, she could see the yard, the wagon, the ranch hands. The doctor bent over the wagon bed, Tobias standing close with June's hand in his, both of them watching Silas with the focused attention of children who are old enough to understand consequences. She stood there for a moment, holding the document case against her chest. She was exhausted in a way that had gone past feeling and into something more fundamental, a tiredness that lived in her actual bones, in the specific tissue of her shoulders and arms, in the back of her eyes. But the documents were in her hands. Silas was alive. Her children were safe. Those were the three things that mattered, and all three of them were true. And she stood in the hallway of someone else's house and held that truth for exactly as long as she could afford before she pushed it away and went out to see what still needed doing. The doctor was finishing his initial assessment when she came into the yard. He was a direct man, Pierce, and he delivered his findings without softening them. The leg had a hairline fracture, not a clean break, which was better than it could have been. The shoulder was dislocated and needed to be set, which was going to be unpleasant. The fever was serious but manageable with proper care. With rest and treatment, Silas Blackwood would recover. It would take time, weeks, possibly months for full function. But he would recover. Silas, flat in the wagon bed, had apparently been listening. "Weeks," he said. "At minimum," Pierce said. "I don't have weeks." "I have a ranch too." "You have a foreman," Lenora said. He turned his head to look at her. "A capable one," she said, "who has apparently been managing this ranch through crises before and will manage it through this one." She held his gaze. "Your job right now is to get better. That's the only job you have." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes, ma'am," he said, finally. Pierce looked at Lenora with the expression of a man who was reassessing a situation he'd walked into with certain assumptions. He didn't comment. He turned back to his patient with his bag open. Harlan appeared beside Lenora. "Cope's ready to ride," he said quietly. She handed him the document case. He took it. For a moment they stood there, the foreman and the widow, in the lamplight of the yard, and there was something passing between them that was simply the acknowledgement of two people who understood what had been at stake and what it had cost. "Your family will stay here tonight," Harlan said. It wasn't a question. Lenora started to object, and then stopped. She was calculating the homestead was miles away. The road was dark. Calder and Voss were somewhere between the canyon and wherever Merrick had told them to go if things went wrong, and her children were asleep on their feet. "Yes," she said, "thank you." Harlan nodded and moved away. Lenora stood in the yard of Blackwood Ranch with the night around her and the lantern light from the porch falling across the dust and the sound of her daughter's breathing nearby. And she let herself feel, for just a moment, full weight of the day, where it had started and where it had ended, and the distance between those 2 points, measured not in miles, but in everything else. Then Tobias was at her elbow. "Mama," he said, "June's asleep, standing up." She looked. June was indeed asleep, upright, leaning against the wagon wheel, with her arms crossed and her chin on her chest, and the expression of someone who had decided sleep was happening regardless of location or circumstances. Lenora went over and picked up her daughter, who weighed more than she remembered and less than she expected, and carried her toward the house. "Is it over?" Tobias asked, walking beside her. She thought about Calder, somewhere in the dark. She thought about Merrick, wherever he was tonight. She thought about Cope, riding hard for the capital with a leather case of evidence across his saddle. Not yet, she said. Tobias nodded. He accepted that the way he accepted most things without pretending it was different from what it was. They went inside. Lenora slept 4 hours on a cot in the room they gave her, which was 4 more than she expected and fewer than she needed, and when she woke, the house was already moving around her. She lay still for a moment and listened to it, boots on floorboards, the distant sound of someone working in the kitchen, a door closing somewhere below. The sounds of a large working household in early morning, the specific rhythm of a place that runs itself by habit, whether or not its owner is conscious. She sat up. Her body registered its opinion of the previous day in comprehensive detail. Both shoulders, the small of her back, her hands, which had done more gripping and pulling in the last 24 hours than in the previous month combined. She sat with it for a moment the way you sit with something that isn't going to change, regardless of how you feel about it, and then she stood up and found her boots. June was in the other bed, still completely unconscious, one arm thrown over the side in the abandoned posture of a child in deep sleep. Tobias was gone, his cot was empty, and made as well as an 11-year-old makes a cot, which was to say the blanket was pulled up and roughly flat, and that was considered sufficient. She found him in the kitchen. He was at the table with a plate of eggs and a mug of something hot, talking to one of the ranch hands, an older man, maybe 45, with the deliberate speech of someone who chose words carefully. They were discussing horses. Specifically, they were discussing the particular qualities of Preach versus the qualities of working cow horses, and Tobias was holding his own in the conversation with the focused interest he brought to topics that genuinely engaged him. He looked up when Lenora came in. "There's eggs," he said. "See that, and coffee." He said it like he was 8 years old again and had found something good, and she felt the complicated mixture of relief and love that came with seeing your child simply be a child after a day that had required him to be considerably more than that. She sat. She ate. She drank the coffee, which was strong enough to have opinions, and she let herself do those things without rushing, because the next part of the day was going to require everything she had, and starting it depleted was not going to help. The ranch hand, whose name turned out to be Felix, told her, while she ate, that Silas had come through the night. Doc Pierce had set the shoulder before midnight, which Lenora gathered had been a considerable event, and had administered something for the fever, and had left instructions with the housekeeper before riding home in the early hours. He would return this afternoon. "How is he this morning?" she asked. "Awake," Felix said, complaining about being in bed. A pause. "So better." She finished her coffee and went to find him. The room they had put Silas in was at the back of the house. A room that she gathered was his actual bedroom based on the boots by the door and the particular worn look of the chair beside the window. He was in the bed with the look of a man who was present and aware but paying a significant price for both. Color in his face was better than it had been on the plane, still not good, but moving in the right direction. His right arm was immobilized against his side where the shoulder had been set. His left hand was resting on the blanket. He heard her come in and turned his head. "Get off, all right," was the first thing he said. "Harlan sent him last night. He should be most of the way to the capital by now." Silas exhaled. "Good." He paused. "The documents were intact?" "All of them." He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, the quality of his expression had changed something, had released in him, some sustained tension that had apparently been occupying space he needed for other things. "You checked them," he said. "Yourself." "I needed to know." "Yes." A pause. "What did you find?" "Everything you described." "More. I think there were account records going back further than you mentioned. 3 years at least." She sat in the chair by the window without being invited, because standing through this conversation seemed unnecessarily formal, given everything. He was patient about it. Very systematic. Silas's jaw tightened. "I know. That's what I missed. I was looking for the kind of theft that makes noise, and he was doing the kind that doesn't. He had help," she said. "There are 2 names in the correspondence that aren't Calder or Voss. A notary in Belden and someone at the Territorial Land Office." Silas looked at her sharply. "You read it carefully." "I had to know what we were dealing with." He was quiet for a moment, processing. Then, The notary in Belden is a man named Schiff. I've met him twice. He paused. I would never have looked at him. That's probably why Merrick used him. A silence. Outside the window, the ranch was conducting its morning cattle sounds from the north pasture, a wagon somewhere, the particular creak and activity of a large operation that didn't stop for anyone's drama. It was oddly steadying, that sound, like evidence of something continuing. Harlan told me, Silas said, what you told him last night, about sending Cope, about the documents. He looked at her. You were here maybe an hour, and you were already running the response. Someone had to. Harlan's been foreman here for 22 years. Harlan needed to be with you, she said, and Harlan didn't know what was in those documents. And you did, because you told me. She met his eyes. You told me everything in the wagon. I was just using what you gave me. He held her gaze for a moment. Lenora, he said, yes. I'm going to say something, and I need you to let me finish before you tell me why it's unnecessary. She waited. I don't know how to... He stopped. Tried again. I'm not good at this kind of thing. Elias was apparently better at it than I am. A pause. What you did. Coming into the gorge when nobody else would. Bringing your children into it. The mine, the ceiling, all of it. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at her. I don't have a... He stopped again. The word thank you doesn't fit the size of it. Lenora sat with that. I know, she said. I'm going to find a way to... I didn't do it because I expected something back. I know you didn't. That's not what I... He exhaled with the specific frustration of a man who is articulate in most contexts and is finding this one harder than he expected. I just need you to know that I know what it cost, what it risked. I know. She looked at him for a moment. All right, she said. I believe you. Something settled between them. Not resolved, there was too much unresolved for anything to feel complete, but settled. Like things finding their level. Then Harlan knocked on the open door, and the morning moved on. The situation in town was worse than Lenora had realized. Harlan laid it out in the hallway outside Silas's room, with the directness of a man who believed that accurate information, however uncomfortable, was better than the comfortable alternative. Merrick had been active. In the days since Silas's disappearance, he had been methodically managing the perception of events in Dry Creek, visiting the judge's local representative, the bank officers, the men who held various service contracts with Blackwood Ranch, not making claims, not rushing, simply ensuring that when the question of what happened to Silas Blackwood was formally resolved, the people who mattered had already spent a week thinking about it from Edwin Merrick's preferred angle. He was at the sheriff's office yesterday morning, Harlan said, before we even got back with Mr. Blackwood, talking to Danner about the legal process for declaring an estate. Lenora looked at him. Danner let him. Danner didn't know what we knew. Harlan paused. Danner still doesn't know most of it. He needs to know, she said. Mr. Blackwood needs to be the one to tell him. Officially. With documentation. Harlan paused. But Mr. Blackwood can't ride to town today. No, she agreed. They looked at each other. I can go, she said. Harlan's expression moved through several things quickly. You, Danner, knows me. I live in his county. I found Silas. If I walk into his office with a first-hand account and a description of the documents that are on their way to the Capitol, it's not nothing. It's not the same as Blackwood himself. No. But Blackwood himself is running a fever in the back bedroom, so she paused. Does Danner have any reason not to trust me? Harlan thought about that honestly. No, he said. He thinks you're... He stopped. What? He thinks you're reckless, Harlan said carefully. After yesterday. Most of town does. Most of town thought Silas was dead. A short pause. Yes. Then I'll take reckless over wrong, Lenora said. She went back into Silas's room and told him what she was going to do. He didn't like it immediately, which was visible in the way his expression went flat, the particular flatness of a strong-willed person who has just been told someone else, has made a decision about their situation. Danner should come here, he said. Danner is a territorial sheriff with jurisdiction questions and a man who has spent a week being managed by your business partner. Getting him out here on my word alone. She shook her head. It'll be faster if I go to him. You've been awake 4 hours. I've managed on less. You haven't eaten enough to. Silas. She said his name with a specific quality that stopped the sentence. I'm going. I'm telling you because you should know, not because I'm asking permission. A long pause. Take Felix, he said. All right. And he looked frustrated. There's a letter. In the left desk drawer. Written to Danner, in case something happened to me. I wrote it before I left that morning. It's incomplete, but it covers the core of it. A pause. Take that. She went to the office and found the letter. It was 3 pages in Silas's handwriting, dense and specific, the handwriting of a man accustomed to documenting things precisely. She read it standing at the desk. It named Merrick directly. It described the forged loans. It named the notary in Belden and the contact at the land office. It was not finished, it ended mid-sentence, in a way that was somehow more chilling than if it had ended in a complete thought, the visible evidence of a man interrupted. She folded it and put it in her coat. June was awake when she came back through the hall, sitting at the kitchen table with a second plate of eggs and the expression of someone who had woken in an unfamiliar place and decided to be practical about it rather than confused. "Where are we?" she said. "Blackwood Ranch." June looked around the kitchen with her level assessment gaze. "It's bigger than ours." "Yes. Where are you going?" Lenora paused. "Town, to see the sheriff." June thought about this. "Do you need me?" "I need you to stay here with Tobias." She sat across from her daughter for a moment. "Keep an eye on Mr. Blackwood." June's expression indicated she understood the assignment and found it acceptable. "Is he getting better?" "Slowly. He's stubborn," June said. "Yes. That's probably why he survived," June said, with the matter-of-fact tone she used for observations that seemed obvious to her. Lenora looked at her daughter for a moment. "Probably," she agreed. The ride to Dry Creek took 40 minutes with Felix, setting a pace that was faster than comfortable, and Lenora not objecting. She spent most of it organizing in her head the sequence she would use with Danner, the specific language that would carry most weight, the points where she would let the letter do the work, and the points where her own account was more useful than the written record. She had thought about this kind of thing before. Not in this context, but in others: the conversations with the bank after Elias died, the negotiation over the debt on the homestead, the meeting with the county assessor the previous year when the property tax had come in wrong and she'd had to make the case for the correction herself. She had learned in those conversations that the way you entered a room was almost as important as what you said once you were in it. You could not look apologetic. You could not frame things as requests when they were not requests. You stated what was true, and you did not leave room for the other person to rearrange the facts into a more comfortable shape. Dry Creek in the morning looked exactly as it always had, which should not have been surprising, but was, slightly. 7 days of crisis, and the storefronts were still open, and the horses were still tied at their usual rails, and Marta Segel was visible through the laundry window doing whatever Marta Segel was always doing. But people noticed Lenora riding down Main Street with Felix beside her. She saw them look. She saw the looks pass between people, the kind that carried information in a shorthand that small towns developed. She had lived here long enough to read most of it, and what she read was, "She's back. She went into the canyon. She found him. What happens now?" She tied her horse outside the sheriff's office and went in. Danner was at his desk with a cup of coffee and some papers, and the expression of a man who was doing administrative work because the alternative was thinking too hard about the past week. He looked up when she came in. His expression didn't exactly register surprise, but it registered the recognition that something significant was about to happen. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "Sheriff." She sat in the chair across from his desk without waiting to be invited, put the letter on the desk in front of him, and said, "That was written by Silas Blackwood before he left the morning he went missing. I need you to read it, and then I'm going to tell you the rest." Danner looked at the letter, then at her. Then he picked it up and read it. He read it twice. Lenora waited. She was good at waiting. When Danner put the letter down, his face was different from when he'd picked it up, not dramatically, but the particular subtle difference of a man who has had his mental map of a situation corrected in several significant places simultaneously. "Where is Blackwood now?" he said. "His ranch, under a doctor's care. He's not well enough to be moved." She paused. "He'll be available for a formal statement when he's stronger. Could be 3 or 4 days. This letter names Merrick directly." "Yes, Merrick was in this office yesterday." "I know. Harlan told me." She met his eyes. "What did he want?" Danner was quiet for a moment, the quiet of a man deciding how much to share with someone he hasn't previously treated as an equal in this kind of conversation. He wanted to know the legal timeline for estate proceedings, Danner said. Said he was concerned about the financial welfare of Blackwood's employees if the estate was in limbo too long. He was building a timeline, Lenora said, in your office, so that when he moved to claim the property, there was a record of his concern for the employees going back to before Silas turned up alive. Danner looked at her. Yes, he said, after a moment. That's one way to read it. It's the accurate way. He tapped the letter with one finger, the documents he's describing. Forged loans. Where are they? On their way to the territorial court. A rider left the ranch last night, she paused. There's also a notary in Belden named Schiff, and a contact at the land office. Both named in correspondence found in Blackwood's private records. Danner picked up a pen, made a note. I'll need to send a wire to Belden. Today would be better than tomorrow. He glanced up at her. She looked back. There was a moment where he was clearly deciding something she could see it. The specific interior negotiation of a man who has been operating under one set of assumptions and is now being asked to reorient quickly in a direction that required him to admit, implicitly, that he'd been managed. Calder and Voss, he said. They came through the canyon. They followed us in. I blocked the passage with a section of mine ceiling. She paused. They were alive when I left them. Unhappy, but alive. Danner put his pen down and looked at her properly, not in the way he'd been looking at her for the past 2 minutes, which was the look of a man processing a report, but in the way of a man looking at a person. 7 days, he said, every search party I had. They were looking in the right territory, she said, not unkindly. Just through an entrance that didn't work for a group. You went alone, with my children and my mule. He was quiet for a moment. That was, he stopped. Tried again. I called off the search. Yes, I was wrong. She didn't say anything to that. It didn't require a response. The people in town, he said. When you rode past this morning, they saw you. Yes. By noon, everyone's going to know Blackwood is alive. He paused. And by this afternoon, Merrick is going to know we know. Lenora had thought about this on the ride in. That's why you need to move today, she said. Not tomorrow. Before he has time to... I understand the urgency, Mrs. Whitfield, he said it with an edge that was not quite irritation, more like the slight friction of a man who is used to being the one who identifies the urgency. She acknowledged that with a small nod and said nothing further. Danner stood. He was already reaching for his hat. I need to find Merrick, he said. He'll be at his office. He keeps regular hours. She stood too. He doesn't know yet that anything has changed. You have a window. Danner looked at her. How do you know where he keeps his hours? My husband did business with him twice. He said Merrick was the most regular man he'd ever dealt with. Same hours, same chair, same order of operations every day. She paused. My husband said it made him nervous. Very regular people are usually hiding something. Danner put on his hat. Your husband sounds like he was a perceptive man, he said. He was, she said. He was also usually right. She followed the sheriff out. What happened next in Dry Creek happened quickly by small-town standards, and slowly by the standards of someone who had spent the previous day in a canyon being chased by hired killers. Danner moved to Merrick's office with Felix and a deputy. Lenora waited on the street. She could see the office from where she stood, a 2-story building near the bank, neat and institutional, the kind of building that had been designed to look like money without spending too much of it. She waited 23 minutes. Then Danner came out with Merrick between himself and the deputy, and Merrick was, there was no other word for it contained. His face was the face of a man who had prepared for several versions of this situation and was now identifying which version had arrived and updating his response accordingly. He was not shouting. He was not making a scene. He walked with the controlled correctness of a man who believed the situation was still manageable and was not going to give anything away that he didn't have to. He saw Lenora. She watched him process it, watched him identify her, the widow, the one from the canyon, the one who should not have found Blackwood and had found him anyway, and watched his face go through a series of small adjustments that added up to the recognition that his timeline had failed. He said nothing to her. She said nothing to him. Danner's deputy took Merrick toward the jail, and Danner came back to where Lenora was standing. He's talking about lawyers, Danner said. He'll have them here by tomorrow, Lenora said, which is why Cope needs to reach the Capitol Court before they do. I've wired Belden about Schiff. He paused. The land office contact will be harder. Silas can tell you more than I can about that. When he's strong enough. Danner nodded. He was looking at the building Merrick had just been walked out of with the expression of a man recalibrating a lot of things simultaneously. Mrs. Whitfield, he said. Yes, when all this is settled. He paused. How are your finances? She looked at him. It was not the question she'd expected. She stopped. Why do you ask? Because I should have asked before, he said. There are 3 or 4 families on the South Road that I know are in difficulty, and I've been telling myself it wasn't my business, and he stopped. He was slightly uncomfortable and not hiding it well, and she respected him for not hiding it. Blackwood's alive, partly because you had the knowledge to find him. And you have that knowledge because of circumstances that I and most of this town never. He stopped again. I should have asked before. Lenora looked at him for a moment. We're managing, she said. We've been managing. Is there anything? There's a well on the South Road that's been bad for 2 seasons, she said. The Kellerman family, the price is mine. If someone with authority pushed the county to put in a community well that reached those properties, that would matter more than... She paused. More than most things I could think of. Danner made a note. She believed him. She wasn't sure why. Exactly he'd called off the search, and he'd let Merrick sit in his office and talk about estates. But he'd read Silas's letter twice, and he'd moved on Merrick within the hour, and he was making notes in the street with the expression of a man who had shifted from one way of seeing something to another and was not going to shift back. People were imperfect, and occasionally they changed. That was something Elias had believed. She was still deciding how much she believed it herself. Felix rode back with her to the ranch. The afternoon was cooling, the light going golden across the grassland, and she rode with the specific kind of tiredness that comes after sustained tension releases not relief exactly. More like the feeling of muscles that have been braced for a long time finally being told they can stop. Her shoulders ached. Her lower back was a separate issue she was ignoring. She was aware of being hungry in a real and fundamental way for the first time in 2 days. When they came back through the ranch gate, Tobias was in the yard. He was with one of the younger hands, looking at a horse not touching it, just looking at it with the focused attention he brought to things that genuinely interested him. The hand was talking, explaining something, and Tobias was listening the way he listened when he was absorbing information rather than just hearing it. He saw his mother and broke away from the conversation and came over. How did it go? He asked. They have Merrick, she said. Tobias exhaled. Just slightly not a big display, just a small release of someone who had been carrying a specific weight and has been told it can be put down. Halder and Voss. Danner's got men at the canyon entrance. They'll come out eventually. She dismounted and handed her horse to Felix. Are you all right? He looked at her. It was a complicated look for an 11-year-old older than 11 in its composition, younger in the way it was delivered, as if he was allowing himself something he usually kept managed. I was worried, he said. When you were in town. I know. I didn't tell June she would have been. I know, she said again. She put her arm around his shoulders, and he let her, which he was starting to do less as he got older, and which she therefore noticed every time it happened. They walked toward the house. The man, Tobias said. The hand I was talking to, he said. Mr. Blackwood was asking about us this morning. Asking what? Just asking who we were, where the homestead was. He paused. He said. Mr. Blackwood asked whether my father had ever worked with his cattle operation. Lenora was quiet. Had he, Tobias asked. Once or twice. Sold him maps. Did some work in the canyon country. She paused. Why? Tobias shrugged slightly. I don't know, just wondered. They went inside. Silas was sitting up when she came to the room, not much, propped against the headboard rather than lying flat, but it was a change from the morning. Danner has Merrick, she said before he could ask. His expression moved through several things. The documents. Cope is on the road. You can't intercept that. She sat in the chair. The lawyers will come tomorrow. Danner knows that. He's wiring the court directly. Schiff in Belden. Danner wired Belden this afternoon. Silas processed this. Then you did all of this in 4 hours. It needed doing. Lenora, he looked at her directly. Stop saying it like it's obvious. It is obvious. It's not. His voice was not angry, it carried something else. The particular quality of a man who is trying to say something and is being deflected and knows he's being deflected. Most people don't walk into a sheriff's office and reorganize his understanding of a situation in whatever time that took you. I had a letter, she said. Your letter. My letter named names. You explained it. You anticipated what Merrick would do and told Danner where to be. That's not the letter. She didn't say anything. Why do you do that, he said. Do what? Make yourself smaller than you are. The room was quiet. Outside, the late afternoon sounds of the ranch, the cattle, a door somewhere, the particular settling sounds of a large house in the hours before evening. I've spent 3 years, she said, slowly, being a widow on a failing homestead in a town where people decide what you're capable of based on what your husband owned. She paused. You learn to be careful about how much space you take up. He was quiet for a long moment. That ends, he said. She looked at him. Not I don't mean. He looked frustrated with himself. I'm not making a declaration. I just mean he stopped. Tried a different way. The well on the South Road. I've known about it for 2 seasons. She blinked. Harlan mentioned it to me year before last, Silas said. I meant to look into it. I didn't. His jaw tightened. I had the resources to fix it in an afternoon, and I did nothing. She was very still. That ends, he said again. Whatever else happens. That specific thing ends. She looked at him, at this man who had been held together by stubbornness and fever, and something she was still trying to name. This man who had broken his portion of biscuit and handed half back to her in a dark canyon. This man who had asked about Elias and listened to the answer, and she didn't know what to do with the feeling that came up in her. So she did what she did with most things she didn't know what to do with. She filed it away and looked at something practical. You should sleep, she said. I've been sleeping all day. You've been unconscious all day. Those are different things. He almost smiled. Almost June told me that, he said. Differences. She gets it from somewhere, Lenora said. She stood. He watched her stand. Will you? He stopped. Started again. Tomorrow. Will you still be here tomorrow? She thought about the homestead, the 2 rooms and the leaking corner and the well that had been bad for 2 seasons. She thought about the morning routine and the animals and the 10 things that needed doing every day to keep the place functioning. She thought about Tobias in the yard with the ranch hand and the horse. She thought about June sitting beside this man in a dark mine with her hand against his arm, simply present, asking for nothing in return. Yes, she said, we'll be here tomorrow. She went to the door. Lenora, she stopped. Thank you, he said, for all of it. I know you said, he paused. I know, but thank you anyway. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Get some rest, she said. You look terrible. She heard him exhale, not quite a laugh, not quite not one, as she walked away down the hall. They stayed 3 more days at Blackwood Ranch. Lenora had not planned for 3 days. She had planned for 1, possibly 2, with the practical justification that Silas needed someone nearby who understood the full scope of what had happened, someone who could answer questions from Danner, who could speak to what was in the documents if Cope ran into trouble on the road, who could manage the small but significant details that kept slipping through the gaps between Harlan's oversight of the ranch operation and the doctor's oversight of Silas's recovery. Those were real reasons. She knew they were real because she checked them honestly each morning, and they held up. She also knew they were not the only reasons. On the second morning, Danner rode out with a deputy to take Silas's formal statement. He brought a court recorder, a thin, precise young man who wrote everything down in a shorthand that looked like a foreign language and translated it into something legible with impressive speed. Silas sat up in bed with his arm still immobilized and spoke for 2 hours in the flat, detailed voice of a man giving testimony he had been composing in his head for weeks. He named every name. He gave dates, amounts, account numbers. He described the morning of the accident with the specificity of someone who had spent 7 days in a dark space with nothing to do but remember. Lenora sat in the hall outside the room. She was not in the statement. There was no reason for her to be in the room. But she sat in the hall because Silas had asked her to, in the particular indirect way he had of asking for things without calling them requests, he had said. The night before, that it would be useful to have someone nearby who could confirm the sequence of events in the canyon if the recorder had questions. She had understood that this was not really about the recorder. When Danner came out, he stopped beside her chair. Schiff confessed, he said. Yesterday afternoon. Belden Sheriff picked him up, and he lasted about 20 minutes before he told them everything. He paused. The land office contact is a man named Pruitt. He's already hired lawyers. Will it matter? She asked. The lawyers. For Pruitt, maybe. He was a small piece. Danner shook his head. For Merrick, no. What Blackwood just gave me in there, combined with those documents, there's nowhere for Merrick to go with this. Lenora absorbed that. Calder and Voss, she asked. Calder came out of the canyon on his own the morning after you did. Walked into town, which I did not expect, and turned himself in. Danner's expression suggested this had surprised him more than he wanted to admit. Said he wanted to talk about what Merrick had paid him to do. He's making a deal, trying to. Danner paused. Voss is still in the canyon as far as we know. We've got men on both exits. He'll come out when he gets hungry enough. Lenora thought about Calder's voice in the dark passage, that almost conversational calm. She thought about what Silas had said, that Calder had a line he wouldn't cross. Maybe that line, it turned out, included not taking the consequences for a man who had hired him and was now going to spend considerable energy making sure the hired men absorbed as much of the legal weight as possible. He was right about one thing, she said. Who? Calder. In the canyon. He said I couldn't run forever. She paused. He was right. I wasn't running. That's different. Danner looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said. I suppose it is. He left. The third day was quieter. The immediate urgency had passed, not the legal process, which would grind on for months in the way that legal processes did, but the acute danger, the sense of things being in active motion that could go wrong. Cope had sent a wire back from the capital. The documents had been received by the territorial court clerk and logged. A judge had been assigned. Merrick's lawyers had arrived in Dry Creek and been informed politely and specifically that their client's situation was considerably more documented than he had apparently led them to believe. Lenora learned all of this through Harlan, who had developed the habit of finding her in whatever part of the house or yard she was occupying and delivering updates with the brisk efficiency of a man who had decided she was a relevant party to information and was acting accordingly. She noticed this and did not comment on it. On the afternoon of the third day, she went to the kitchen and made biscuits. It was not a grand gesture. She made biscuits because the kitchen had the ingredients, and she was accustomed to doing something useful with her hands when her mind was working through things. And standing in a strange kitchen making familiar things was the closest she had come in 3 days to feeling like herself. The housekeeper, a woman named Clara, who had been at the ranch for 11 years and had views about her kitchen that she expressed through strategic silence rather than direct objection, watched this happen from the doorway for a few minutes and then came in and found something to do at the other end of the room, which Lenora understood as acceptance. June materialized as June tended to do when baking was happening. She pulled a stool to the counter and sat on it and watched with the proprietary interest of someone who considered herself a relevant party to any culinary operation within range. Are those the same as ours? She asked. Same recipe. They won't taste the same, June said. No, Lenora agreed. Different water. Different air. She worked the dough. They'll be close. June was quiet for a moment. Mama. Are we going home tomorrow? Lenora kept working. Yes. A pause. Tobias doesn't want to, June said. Lenora glanced at her daughter. He didn't say so, June continued. But I can tell. He's been watching how everything works here. Cattle operation and the equipment, and the way Harlan manages the hands. A pause. He's been taking notes in his head. That's what he does, Lenora said. I know. June watched the dough. Is that bad? No. It's just what he does. He misses Dad, June said. Not as a revelation, as a statement of fact, delivered with the directness she brought to everything. He needs someone to, I don't know, show him things, the way Dad used to. Lenora's hand slowed slightly, then continued. I know, she said. Mr. Blackwood showed him something yesterday, June said, about reading cattle for health signs. He talked him through it from the window. A pause. Tobias asked him, 4 questions. Mr. Blackwood answered all of them, like they were good questions. Lenora said nothing. They were good questions, June said. The biscuits went into the oven. She brought some to Silas an hour later, on a plate with a cloth over it, because he had not made it to the kitchen table yet, and probably wouldn't today. He was sitting up properly now, not propped. Actually sitting, which was new. And he had papers on the bed around him that she recognized as ranch documents, which meant he had persuaded Harlan to bring them. And Harlan had either agreed or been worn down. And from what she knew of Harlan, she suspected the latter. He looked at the plate. From Clara, he asked. From me. He looked up. She set the plate on the bedside table. June helped. She mostly supervised. Silas looked at the biscuits for a moment. Something moved across his face that he didn't try to hide, which was becoming more characteristic of him as the fever receded, and the careful management he applied to his own expressions had less energy to draw on. Same recipe, he asked. He said it quietly. She understood immediately what he was asking, whether these were the same as the one June had broken in half in the dark, the one that had been their last food, the one he had taken his half of without saying anything that was adequate to the moment. Yes, she said. He picked one up. He didn't eat it immediately. He just held it for a moment. We're going home tomorrow, she said. He looked up. I know you're going to say we should stay. I wasn't going to say that, he said. She paused. The homestead needs managing, she said, slightly recalibrating. The animals have been on their own for 3 days, and there's work that doesn't wait. I know. He set the biscuit down on the plate. I need to talk to you about that. About my homestead. About the well. She was still. I told you that ends, he said. I meant it. I've talked to Harlan. There's a team that can start on a community well for the South Road properties within the week, the kind with enough depth to serve 3 or 4 homesteads through a dry season. He paused. It's not charity. It's what I should have done 2 years ago when I first knew about it. I'm not asking you to feel grateful for something that should already have existed. She looked at him. All right, she said. All right, you accept it? Or all right, you're acknowledging I spoke. All right, I accept it, she said. Because you're right. It's not charity. It's just a well. He nodded. There's something else, he said. She waited. Tobias. He said the name carefully, like he was aware of the weight of the territory he was entering. He's got something. I don't know if you know how much, or maybe you do. You probably do, but the way he listens and asks questions. The way he was in that canyon. The way he managed that mule through the narrow sections. He paused. I'd like to teach him things, if you'd allow it. Saturdays, maybe. He could come out here and work with the operation, and I'd teach him what I know about cattle and land management. Another pause. No obligation on your end. No debt. Just, he's a boy who needs someone to show him things, and I'm a man who has things to show. Lenora sat in the chair by the window. She looked at her hands. She thought about Tobias in the yard with the ranch hand and the horse. She thought about his face when he was listening to Harlan explain something about the water system. She thought about her husband scratching arrows on canyon walls and counting the seasons he'd been through certain passages, building a body of knowledge that he'd passed on to her and that had saved a man's life. Knowledge of a place is the only thing that stays with you when everything else goes wrong. Yes, she said, I'll allow it. Silas exhaled slightly. He might be annoying about it, she added. He asks a lot of questions. I noticed. A pause. I don't mind questions. He'll have opinions, too, about how things should be done. Good. I need people who have opinions. I've had too many people around me who didn't. He looked at her steadily. That was part of how Merrick happened. She nodded. They sat in a quiet that was not uncomfortable. The window light was moving toward late afternoon, the long gold light that came before evening, and it fell across the floor between them in a way that was simply what afternoon light did and had nothing to say about it. Can I ask you something? Silas said. Yes. What would you have done? If you'd come into the canyon and found, he paused. If I hadn't been alive. She thought about it honestly. I'd have come back and told people where I found you, she said. So your people would know. That's all? And I'd have looked for evidence of what happened. Because something about the stallion told me it wasn't an accident. And if it wasn't an accident, then the answer mattered. She paused. What you would have wanted was for Merrick not to get away with it. You didn't know that. I knew enough about the kind of man you were, she said. From what people said. And from the horse. From the horse. A man who checks his own brake assembly the morning of a journey is a man who takes responsibility for his own situation. That kind of man doesn't like being cheated. She paused. I thought, if I found out what happened and who did it, that was something I could do, even after. Silas was quiet. You thought about that, he said. Before you went in, that I might be dead. Yes. And you went anyway. Yes. He looked at her. Most people find it easier, she said, to do the expected thing. Call off the search, accept the probable outcome, move on. She paused. I've never been very good at the expected thing. No, he agreed. You're not. Something in the way he said it, without apology, without the slight edge that phrase sometimes carried when men said it, about women who were more capable than they'd expected, made her look at him directly. He was looking at her with the same quality she had occasionally caught in the last few days, and then deliberately looked away from. She didn't look away this time. Silas, she said. I know, he said. I'm not going to say something that would make you uncomfortable. That's not what this is. What is it? He thought about the answer. I just want to say, he said finally, that I'm aware of what you've done. Not just in the canyon. All of it. The sheriff. The documents. The way you've been in this house for 3 days managing things that weren't yours to manage, because they needed managing, and you were the one who could. He paused. I don't want you to go home tomorrow and have it feel like a job that ended. She looked at him. It doesn't feel like that, she said. Pause. Good, he said. She stood. Eat the biscuits, she said. Clara will be offended if they come back uneaten. They're yours. She doesn't need to know that. She went to the door. Lenora. She stopped. Turn Sunday, he said. I'll be well enough to ride by Sunday. Or close enough. There's a stretch of the North Property cottonwoods along a creek bed. It's a good place, he paused. I'd like to show it to you. All three of you. She stood in the doorway. She thought about all the reasons to say not yet. Or we'll see the careful, measured language she had learned to use for anything that mattered. Because things that mattered could be taken away. And it was better to hold them lightly in your language, even when you weren't holding them lightly anywhere else. Sunday, she said. Not yet. Not maybe. Sunday. She walked back down the hall. They went home the next morning. The homestead looked smaller than she remembered, which was the specific effect of spending 3 days in a place that was considerably larger. It also looked like 3 days of abandonment. The yard needed sweeping. The animals needed attending. There were 2 fence rails she had been meaning to fix for a week before all of this happened. The leaking corner had left a damp patch on the interior wall that she had tried to ignore for 2 months and could no longer credibly pretend was minor. She stood in the middle of it and looked at all of it, and felt, for a moment, the full weight of what her life was. Then she rolled up her sleeves and started on the animals. Tobias worked beside her. June swept. They fell back into the routine of the homestead with the practiced efficiency of people who had been doing it long enough that the routine itself was a kind of comfort, not because it was easy, but because it was theirs, because they knew every part of it, because the competence of managing your own life is its own form of dignity regardless of the scale. In the afternoon, a wagon came from Blackwood Ranch. 2 hands she recognized from the yard. They had lumber in the back, good lumber, straight and dry, and a note from Harlan that said simply the corner. Felix knows what's needed. Tell him where to work. She stood on the porch and looked at the wagon. She thought about refusing it. She thought about what Silas had said. It's not charity. It's just a well. It's what should have already existed. She stepped off the porch. The northeast corner, she told Felix. I'll show you. The repair took the afternoon. Felix, on the other hand, worked with the clean speed of people who knew what they were doing, and by evening the corner was sound in a way it had not been for 2 years. Lenora made coffee and brought it out, and they drank it in the yard, and nobody made anything of it, which was the right way to handle it. After they left, Tobias came and stood beside her, looking at the repaired corner. Did you ask for that? He said. No. He nodded, thinking about it. Mama, he said. Do you like him? She looked at the corner rather than her son. Yes, she said. I like him. Do you feel bad about that? She thought about Elias, about the songs he'd sung badly when he thought no one could hear, about the arrows on the canyon wall, about 11 years of knowing a person and still finding things after that surprised you. I did, she said honestly, for a while. But not now. Not the way I did. She paused. Your father wasn't the kind of man who would have wanted me to feel bad about it. I know that. I just had to get to where I believed it. Tobias was quiet. He'd have liked him, Tobias said. Mr. Blackwood. He'd have thought he was worth knowing. She looked at her son. 11 years old, and already so much of his father in him, the way he watched things, the way he decided things quietly and held them without needing to announce them. Made her proud and sad, and proud of the sad in the way that complicated feelings sometimes resolve into something that is simply love, without adjective. Yes, she said, I think he would have. Sunday came clear and dry, the kind of October morning that the territory occasionally produced as if apologizing for the summer sky so blue it looked painted, air that was cool without being cold, the particular light that made distances look closer than they were. Silas rode over himself. Not easily, she could see it cost him, the shoulder and the leg both registering their opinions about riding at this stage of recovery. He had the expression of a man who had decided the cost was acceptable and was not going to discuss it further. He looked better than he had 5 days ago, which was not the same as looking well, but it was movement in the right direction, and she took it as such. He had 2 horses with him besides his own. Tobias looked at the horses and then looked at his mother with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite getting there. Can you ride? Silas asked him. Some, Tobias said. Not well. That's honest. Silas looked at the horse he'd brought for him, a patient-looking bay with an easy eye. This one doesn't need well. She needs steady. Tobias approached the horse the way he approached most new things, carefully, with respect for what he didn't yet know. He put his hand out and let the horse smell it and stood still and waited. The horse dropped her head slightly. Silas watched this happen. He said nothing, but she saw his expression, and it confirmed something she had already suspected. They rode north. The cottonwoods were where Silas had said they were along a creek bed on the northern property, a stand of them that had been growing long enough to be genuinely tall, their leaves gone to gold and amber in the October cold. Creek was low, but running, which Silas said was unusual for this late in the season, and the sound of it under the cottonwoods was the specific sound of moving water in a dry country, which is the sound of something valuable making itself known. They tied the horses and walked to the bank. June sat on a flat rock and put her hand in the water and announced that it was cold, which nobody had doubted. Tobias walked along the bank, looking at things tracks in the mud, the water plants, the way the creek curved around a boulder downstream. Silas stood beside Lenora and didn't try to fill the silence with talk, which she found she appreciated in a way that was more specific than general. It's a good place, she said. Yes, you've been coming here a long time. Since I bought the property. He was quiet. It was the first place I came after my wife and William died. I rode out here and sat by the creek, and I don't know what I expected to find. It was just somewhere that felt separate from everything else. She looked at the water. Did it help? She asked. Not right away. He paused. Eventually. Or maybe I just kept coming back and time did the work and the place got the credit. He glanced at her sideways. Is that too honest? No, she said. That's just accurate. He was quiet. I didn't know what to do with grief, he said. I hadn't had practice. I'd lost money before, and I'd lost cattle, and I'd had partnerships fail, and I'd handled all of it. I knew how to handle loss that had a ledger somewhere. A pause. The other kind I didn't know. So I did what I knew how to do. I bought more land. I built the operation larger. I put distance between myself and anything that could get close enough till he stopped. To matter, she said, yes. She understood that, not as a criticism, as recognition. She had done her own version of it, smaller in scale, the same in structure. She had put everything into the homestead and the children and the daily survival of the 3 of them, and she had kept the edges of herself very controlled, very managed. And she had called it strength because it looked like strength from the outside and sometimes from the inside too. The thing is, she said, you can work very hard at keeping yourself safe from loss, and it turns out it doesn't work. No, he said, it doesn't. You just end up with a lot of land and no one to ride to the creek with. He looked at her. She looked at the water. That was more direct than I intended, she said. I didn't mind, he said. June's voice came from downstream, announcing that she had found a frog, which she described in considerable detail. Tobias's voice came back asking how large, and June described the size with her hands, even though Tobias couldn't see her hands, which was characteristic of June. Silas watched them for a moment with an expression that had no performance in it at all. "They're remarkable," he said. "They are," she agreed. "They're also frequently exhausting." Yes, he said it with the warmth of someone who had been close enough to the reality of it to find it accurate rather than theoretical. "I imagine they are." She turned to look at him directly. "Silas," she said, "I'm going to say something, and I'm asking you not to respond immediately." He looked at her. "I don't—" She stopped. Tried again. "I'm not good at this kind of thing. I was good at it once, and then I was out of practice for 3 years, and I'm not entirely sure I remember how it works." She paused. "But I think I would like it if you kept coming. Not just for Tobias. For Sunday dinners. For the creek. For whatever this is." She met his eyes. "I'm not asking for anything specific. I'm just saying I'd like it if you kept coming." He was quiet. She had asked him not to respond immediately, and he was honoring that, which she respected. "Then all right," he said. "Just that." She looked back at the creek. "That's a very short response for someone who had a lot to say in a dark canyon," she said. "Some things don't need a lot of words." She almost smiled. Almost. They rode back in the late afternoon, the 4 of them, with the light going low and long across the grassland. June rode beside Silas and informed him that the frog had been approximately the size of her fist and had been green with brown spots and had been completely unbothered by her, which she considered a personal achievement. Silas listened to this with the full attention he brought to things that mattered, which was the same attention, regardless of the topic, and he asked 2 questions about the frog that made June respond with the slightly surprised delight of a child who expected to be tolerated and was instead being taken seriously. Tobias rode on Lenora's side, quiet, watching the landscape with the considering look she knew. "Mama," he said quietly. The bay. Her name is Cora." Felix told me. A pause. "Mr. Blackwood said I could ride her on Saturdays. When I come to learn, I know. She's good." He paused. "I was scared at first, and she seemed to know it, and she just waited." "Good horses do that," Lenora said. "Dad never taught me to ride properly," Tobias said. Not with bitterness, just fact. He kept saying we'd get to it. "I know." A silence. "I'm glad someone's going to," he said. She looked straight ahead at the homestead, coming into view in the distance. "Me too," she said. "What happened afterward happened the way most things in real life happen, not all at once, not dramatically, but in the accumulation of ordinary days that looked small individually and turned out to be large in sum. Merrick's trial took 4 months. The territorial court had the documents and Calder's testimony and Silas's statement and Schiff's confession, and the lawyers Merrick had hired turned out to be less useful than he'd counted on when the weight of evidence reached a certain level. He was convicted on 7 counts. The forged mortgages were voided. The diverted funds, as much as could be traced, were ordered returned. He went to the territorial prison in the spring, and he did not come back. Voss came out of the canyon on the 5th day after Lenora's departure, dehydrated and bad-tempered, and was arrested by Danner's deputies at the western exit. He did not make a deal the way Calder had. He took his sentence without cooperation and without grace, which was consistent with what Silas had said about him. Calder received a reduced sentence for his testimony and served it quietly. Lenora never saw him again. She occasionally thought about him in the canyon, his voice in the dark, the almost conversational calm of a man who was good at something that happened to be terrible. She thought there was something genuinely human in the fact that he had walked into town and turned himself in, rather than spending his remaining options trying to protect Merrick. It didn't excuse what he'd done. But it was something, and she had decided that accounting for the full complexity of people, the bad alongside whatever was still present that wasn't entirely bad was closer to the truth than flattening them into single dimensions. Danner made good on the well. It took longer than a week, the county process being what county processes were, but by early spring the South Road had a community well that reached Lenora's property and the Kellerman place and the Price homestead and 2 others. The first morning it worked properly. Lenora turned the handle and watched the water come up clean and cold, and she stood there longer than was strictly necessary, just watching it. She didn't say anything about it to anyone. She didn't need to. Silas came on Sundays. Not every Sunday, because a ranch of that size produced complications that respected no schedule, and because Lenora had her own work that didn't pause for anyone's visits. But most Sundays, often enough that June began saving him the chair beside hers at the table without being asked, often enough that Tobias started tracking the week by how many days until Saturday, when he rode to the ranch to learn, and Sunday when Silas came south. They did not rush into anything. That was deliberate on both sides and unspoken on both sides, which was the right way to handle it. They had both been broken by loss in the particular way that people who loved fully get broken, not damaged beyond use, but changed in the structural sense. The way a bone that heals after a fracture is never quite the same bone, is sometimes stronger in that spot, and sometimes will always ache in certain weather. They knew this about themselves, and they knew it about each other, and they moved accordingly. Silas told her once, on a Sunday evening in early spring, when the cottonwoods on the North Creek were just beginning to leaf out, that he had bought more land in the years after his wife died, because he'd believed that accumulating things was the same as building a defense. That if he made himself large enough and powerful enough, then loss couldn't find him in the same way twice. Lenora told him that she had believed, for 3 years, that allowing herself to need anyone would be a betrayal of the people she'd already needed and already lost. They sat with both things for a while. Neither of those worked, Silas said eventually. No, she agreed. They really didn't. So she said. That was the closest they came to having the conversation directly. It was enough. By summer, Silas was not so much visiting the Whitfield homestead as simply present in it in the ways that mattered. The broken fence had been rebuilt, not by hands he sent, but by himself. On a Saturday, when Tobias was learning cattle work, and June had decided to supervise, and Lenora was doing the books, and came outside to find him at the fence line with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, doing the work the way he did most physical things, methodically, without ceremony, more competent at it than you'd expect from a man who could afford to have anyone else do it for him. She had stood at the porch and watched him for a moment. You don't have to do that, she'd said. I know, he'd said. It needed doing. She'd gone back inside. But she'd been aware of him out there for the rest of the afternoon in the way you're aware of something that belongs. Following spring, beneath the cottonwoods on the North Creek, where the first leaves were coming out pale gold in the early light, Silas Blackwood asked Lenora Whitfield a question. He didn't dress it up. He was not a man who dressed things up. I'd like us to be married, he said, if you'd have me. She looked at the creek. She thought about the canyon. About a man lying in the dark who opened his eyes and tracked a lantern. About a biscuit broken in half. About fingers touching in the dark when someone gave back half of what they'd been given. About the specific quality of a person who notices you're lying, about not being hungry and breaks their portion anyway and hands it across without making a thing of it. She thought about Elias, about the songs and the arrows on the wall and the maps and the knowledge he'd built and left behind like a kind of inheritance that had saved a man's life 3 winters after he was gone. She thought about what it meant to have a future that didn't require forgetting a past. Yes, she said, I'll have you. He exhaled. It was not a romantic exhale. It was the exhale of a man who had been holding his breath and is now breathing again, which is the most honest version of how that kind of relief actually sounds. June's going to have opinions about the arrangements, Lenora said. Yes, he said, she will. Tobias will pretend not to care, and will care enormously. I know, she looked at him. I'm not easy, she said. I want to be honest about that. I have opinions, and I'll say them. I won't be managed. I'll argue with you when I think you're wrong, and I'll probably be right a reasonable percentage of the time. Good, he said. That's what I want. You might change your mind about that. She looked at the creek. I'm not going to move into the mansion, she said. He was quiet. It's too big for people who are trying to know each other, she said. I'd get lost in it, and you'd get lost in it, and we'd spend 3 years passing in hallways. All right, we can expand the homestead, build it properly. All right, he said again. She glanced at him. You're agreeing to everything, because you're right about everything. He paused. So far, she almost laughed. They were married that June in the yard of the homestead with the new well and the rebuilt fence and the enlarged house that was not finished but was close enough. Danner came. Harlan came, looking uncomfortable in a good jacket but present and accounted for. Felix came with his wife, the Kellerman family, from down the South Road. Prices. Doc Pierce, Cope, back from the capital months ago and now a permanent hand at the ranch, who had brought flowers that he handed to June with an awkward solemnity that made June visibly decide to take them graciously, rather than point out that he appeared nervous. Tobias stood beside Silas. He had asked, quietly, a week before, if he could. Silas had said yes without hesitation. Tobias had nodded and not said anything else, which was how he handled things that mattered. June walked her mother down the yard. She did it with the absolute composure of a child who has decided this is serious and is taking it seriously, and she only broke it once when Lenora whispered, too quiet for anyone else to hear. Your father would have liked this. And June nodded and looked straight ahead and blinked twice and kept walking. They stood in the June sun and said what needed saying. Afterward, someone brought food from the kitchen, and people ate and talked, and the children ran, and there was nothing perfect about any of it. The food ran short at one point. There was a disagreement about where to put the tables. Creech got into the yard and had to be persuaded out by Tobias using the low and bored voice, and Silas's shoulder bothered him in the afternoon sun, and he didn't mention it until Lenora noticed and handed him something Pierce had left for exactly that purpose. The faded patchwork quilt, mended in 6 places, lived on their bed for the rest of their lives. Silas had 100 opportunities to replace it with something finer and never did. Because that quilt was a dark canyon and a broken biscuit and 3 knocks on stone when everyone had already given up. It was a woman descending into a place where nobody else would go, carrying a lantern and a rope and 2 children, and the stubborn, unreasonable refusal to accept that a person was gone before she had looked for them herself. That was not something you replaced. Years later, people in Dry Creek told the story the way small towns tell the stories that define them, with embellishment, with compression, with the specific shape that a story takes when it has been passed from mouth to mouth until it fits comfortably in the telling. In the popular version, it was simpler than it had been, cleaner. The truth was messier, which was the truth of most things worth telling. A woman who had nothing except knowledge decided that knowledge was sufficient to try. A man who had everything except the right things lay in the dark and waited to see if anyone would come. And what saved him was not strength in the traditional sense, not weaponry or numbers or wealth or power. It was the specific human stubbornness of someone who looked at the word impossible and decided to take it as a description of the current situation rather than a verdict on the outcome. The frontier taught many lessons. The one it taught hardest and most repeatedly was this, that the value of a person has no reliable relationship to what they own, and that the quality most likely to save your life is not the quality that looks impressive from a distance. It is the quality of someone who keeps searching after everyone else has gone home. That is who Lenora Whitfield was. That is who she remained. And that, in the end, turned out to be more than enough.